said he may be able to call in at some point, so we got that all set up. Just do what you can, yeah.
That's fine.
I'll now call to order this special called meeting of the Moore County Board of Education. It is Thursday, October 21st, and we're beginning this meeting at 8:30 a.m., anticipating quite a long run. I'll go ahead and note that Ms. Caldwell has just sent word that she is running a little bit late, and Mr. Holmes is not able to join us this morning, but may be calling in later. At this time, I'll ask for a motion to approve the agenda as presented.
So moved.
Second.
A motion by Mr. Levy, second by Ms. Thompson. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries 5-0. Would you please now join me in standing for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And I'll ask Vice Chair Thompson to lead us in a moment of silence.
If we could just take this time, everyone, for a moment of silence, please. Thank you. I
Thank
wanted
you.
to say, Lord, help us through, but I didn't.
And I'm thinking, and let's send good thoughts to our teachers and our students too, who are approaching the end of the first 9 weeks. I believe that 9 weeks closes out tomorrow.
Yeah.
And I know that we've been going through NC check-ins and lots of midterm exams, or not technically exams, midterm testing. And the stress level is high because there haven't been any breaks this fall since Labor Day. So I'm sure they are all looking forward to Election Day and Veterans Day soon to come, when they'll have a little bit of time off. So we're sending good, strong thoughts to all those folks out in our schools. At this time, we can move on to item 2A, an update on optional diagnostic COVID-19 testing. Dr. Grimacy.
And I'll turn it over to Dr. Locklear and Dr. Powers. Any opening remarks? This item is on the agenda primarily because we have some board members that had some questions, and so we're going to make ourselves available. Do you have anything to open with, gentlemen? No PowerPoint, but any?
No, sir, nothing specific. We sent out information to our families and community in the last week, and certainly our Dr. Powers and I are available for any questions.
Why don't we just do a quick outline of the program and just kind of get the conversation started, and then entertain any questions.
Absolutely, and I'm glad to share some additional information that we've gained since we reported on this in the September monthly board update, and I'll share that we'll also have some additional information as a part of the October monthly board update as well. But just to kind of reflect and share some of that information and perhaps answer some questions before you have them. The state offers this program, and it's an elective program, and approximately 85% of our school districts in the state have chosen to participate. It is free testing. Moore County schools will be doing free diagnostic testing. The state provides approximately $1.4 million for administration of testing in our schools, and that is for just the 2021-22 school year, so it is a temporary program just to get us through the crisis with COVID. The funds allow for the purchase of testing-related equipment, materials, supplies, and also the hiring of personnel. So Moore County Schools is seeking to hire 14 testing nurses and 1 lead testing nurse. So, and at this point, you know, we've been advertising, and we're currently in the process of hiring 9 testing nurses and 1 lead nurse. The nurses will be trained in the testing protocol over the next couple of weeks, and the goal will be that we will begin offering free testing in all our schools the week of November 8th. I also want to point out that, of course, testing is optional. It's by parent consent only, so there is a registration form that has to be completed by the parent that also provides their consent. Just to give you an idea of how that would work at a school if a child were to become symptomatic and need to be tested. So if that child becomes symptomatic at school, as is the process now, they would go to the office, be placed in the isolation room. The parent would be contacted. If the parent has provided consent, once the parent is contacted, they would be asked if they would like to have their child tested while they're at school before they're taken home. And then if the parent says yes, they would be tested. The parent says no, they would not. If the child becomes symptomatic while at home and they're not at school, of course, they would still have the option to be tested at school if the parent has consented. So if that were the case, the parent could simply call the school and schedule a time when they could bring the child, and they would be tested in kind of a drive-through testing manner, the way that you've seen operate at many places that do COVID testing.
Seth, if the parent has not pre-registered, in the case where a child is in the isolation room at school, per our procedure, and the parent hasn't pre-registered, is that any different than if the parent pre-registers?
Yes, so the parent's going to be contacted either way, and if they have not provided consent, they would be asked by the school nurse at that time, you know, would you like to? We have this free testing available. You know, would you like to take advantage of that? And if the parent wishes to, then at that time, they can work with the parent to get them registered and get the documentation of their consent.
Yeah, because we need the written consent, just to make sure that that's made clear.
Correct.
You need the written consent one way or another. If the parent has already provided written consent, they're still going to get a phone call. They're still going to have that opportunity. And they might just say, go ahead and test. I'm on the way. Go ahead and test them while I'm on the way. If you haven't pre-registered, we have to wait till you get there and sign the consent before we proceed. So really, we had some questions from our parent advisory committee about that, and it was helpful for all of them when we explained that with that.
Yep.
And is this available for employees as well?
It is. So in addition to students, it is available for Moore County Schools employees. We have heard some recent media reports that OSHA may begin requiring employers that employ more than 100 employees to require vaccinations or test unvaccinated employees once a week. So since we will have this program in place, I mean, what a great opportunity. We'll already have something set up where those unvaccinated employees have the opportunity for free, convenient testing at their school site each week.
If they're uncomfortable getting the vaccine, then this would be an option for them, and they can just look at it as a testing option if they're uncomfortable with the vaccination. And fortunately, we have such a high vaccination rate among our employees that, you know, it really won't be that many that would need the weekly testing if they prefer not to get vaccinated.
Correct.
So,
I think the key,
go ahead.
just going to say, I think the key word there too is that this is an option. So it's an option for our staff that may want to take advantage. It's an option for our parents that may want to take advantage. Again, it's free. It's there at the school site, so it's very convenient. I'll also share that the tests that will be administered will be PCR tests, and what has been shared with us, based on what's going on in some of the other school districts who are already implementing this, is that we expect that those test results to be back approximately within a 24-hour period.
So, just to reiterate, there is no circumstance or situation to where a student would be tested without written consent from the parent.
That is correct.
Okay, and so what happens in situations to where a student may present with symptoms and you feel like this student needs testing, however, the parent is at work and may not be able to get there, the student just goes home, or what happens?
Yes, the student would go home, and the student's going to have to be picked up, and like you said, maybe it's not the parent that's able to come pick up the student, maybe it's the grandparent. Either way, the child is symptomatic, and a symptomatic
Right.
child can't remain at school, so they would go home.
Okay.
And then we would continue to try to make contact with that parent so that they could share with us, and then they would have the opportunity to bring the child back to school to do the drive-through type
Okay.
testing. Uh-huh.
And with regard to our staff, Seth, at this point, vaccines are optional for all of our employees, is that correct?
That is correct.
So the statements that we are required to have a vaccine before we go to work or whatever, that is not true, is it?
At this point, it is not true.
Okay,
Yeah, at this point, it's not. We've just, from media reports, we want to get ahead of that.
Okay.
We've heard that just this week.
okay.
It was just fortunate that we already have the testing program in place, because that, based on the preliminary stuff that we've read, unlike some other cities and municipalities across the country and whatnot, the weekly testing option will be available for us, as opposed to some of the other things you're hearing about in the news. And if that's the case, then we'll be glad to make that option available to our employees for free, and make it easy too. We'll find a way to, if that happens, we think we're going to be in a position to accommodate our employees who prefer not to get vaccinated.
Absolutely, and I think those employees will be extremely appreciative of that,
I
and
think so,
having the
too.
option to do that right at
Right.
school
Right.
easily
Yeah.
each week, yeah.
I think it's just great for us to have dollars to come in to help us out with getting additional nurses. We know and we've realized that the number of nurses that we have doesn't correlate to the students that they are having to service. So having additional nurses, 9, come in and be able to help with whatever it is that we need at our schools as far as medical, I think is a great opportunity.
And the primary function of these COVID nurses will be testing first.
Absolutely.
But then the secondary function, when they're not
Yeah.
tied up with testing, would be to support the school nurses
Yeah.
in whatever, the school health needs are.
Yeah,
So that would eliminate quite the burden of contact tracing
yeah.
that it's currently falling on all
Would
our
be,
school
will
nurses
be
as
very
well.
helpful to our schools in terms of that, yes.
Okay, my
So,
understanding,
well-
you can, one more. It's available K through 12,
Will be available at all of our schools.
because I can anticipate families getting ready to travel for the holidays who need a negative COVID test perhaps before flying, and/or want to do it before they visit grandparents somewhere else, could take availability of this, and it's much easier than taking a 5-year-old to and making the appointment and getting them to the pediatrician and/or family practitioner to have that test. So it could be of great interest to parents who are anticipating holiday travel.
Just to be clear on that particular situation, though, Chair Carter, this is just for students and employees. We
Right.
wouldn't be able
No,
to.
not the families.
Yeah, we
but-
wouldn't be able to do
but-
it for the family.
Yeah, I mean, an adult can go many places and receive COVID testing, but children, especially the younger children, cannot. So it could be of great availability to them. Mr. Hensley?
Is my microphone working?
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Yes,
okay. So I have some concerns about this, but I got to address one thing that Chair Carter brought up. Exactly how is COVID testing going to reduce the need for contact tracing? They're two separate issues. Contact tracing, per what the superintendent said at the last meeting, was so that we could immediately identify students that were exposed and get them quarantined, whereas COVID testing is, 48, 72, 96 hours after they've been exposed and symptoms present themselves. So they're actually two separate issues, unless the chair and Mr. Powers want to shed some light as to how they're correlated, because I don't see.
I would
Yeah.
like to,
It-
because
it-
my
Yes, ma'am.
comment was, these nurses will be able to help with contact tracing. Never did I say that it eliminated
Okay, well,
contact
thank you
tracing.
for clarifying.
And
Yeah.
I believe the explanation was that these tests are due back within 24 hours,
Yeah.
which is, that it's not the fastest turnaround you can get, obviously, because they have 30-minute tests available,
Yeah,
but.
Again, I misunderstood, because I
Yeah.
thought that we were saying that a COVID test, negative or positive, and that's just not true.
No, it
So-
wouldn't.
That's correct.
If we step back, my concerns are, it's my I want to know whose authority this expenditure was done under. Because so COVID testing, and Mr. Cox could probably shed some light on this, but I don't think he needs to. This is a new program. This was not a budgeted program. It's my understanding that the superintendent has the unilateral authority to execute expenditures under $50,000. If we're hiring 9 nurses, this is obviously over $50,000. So how does this not require board action?
Mr. Hensley, in our board update on September 22nd, we received the background information from Dr. Powers that explained that this was a grant-funded program. There's no expense to the Moore County schools.
Well, Madam Chair, I disagree. First of all, a board update is not board action, so I think we can all agree on that. Secondly,
Yeah, I could answer the first question. Is secondly related to that, or do you want me to answer the first
No,
question?
it's related to that, and I'm answering the
Okay,
questions.
okay.
Regardless of the source of funding, the powers of the superintendent to execute funding, as far as I know, are agnostic to the source of the funding. It's a $50,000 cap, and this sounds like it's well over $50,000.
It's a fair question. Madam Chair, may I answer the question, please?
Sure.
Okay. Mr. Cox, relative to expenditures over $50,000 or relative to a budget amendment, is there a need for us to get board approval for my authorization of this program as a budget amendment, or can you weigh in on that?
So board policy is $50,000. Anything over $50,000 contracts have to be approved by the board. We haven't expended anything, and the hiring process will be exactly the same as is for anybody else that will come to the board for those nurses. So to accept the grant, once we get it, it will show up as a budget amendment. It will come to the board as a budget amendment once the funding comes to us.
So whether or not the timing of my authorization of us moving forward with the program, in terms of the technical aspects of purchases, if you will, over $50,000, there's still time for the board approval, although should I have acted prematurely in this case, it's awkward because we're already in the process of interviewing for the nurses. None of them have been appointed yet. So there'll still be time. Those positions won't be approved until the school board acts on November 8th. So if there's been an oversight in that, there's time for legal counsel to weigh in and determine if the board needs to approve this or not.
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Yeah, so I think that clearly it's within my authority to authorize an initiative of this nature, but it is a fair question as to whether or not the board needs to act on this, but there's time to do
Dr.
that.
Grimsey, I disagree, and perhaps we need to get the board attorney to weigh in, because,
That's our intention.
well, it may already be too late, and this may be an illegal, unauthorized obligation.
And I would disagree with that.
Well, let me state why. Is if you accept a grant, not you, but if one accepts a grant, then one is obligated to execute the terms of the grant. So I'd have to see how this is structured, but if the state of North Carolina is going to give us a grant, what's the total amount of this? $2 million?
1.4 million, as Dr. Powers just
Okay.
said.
So when we accept the grant, we have effectively signed a contract for that grant, and it obligates us to expend $1.4 million. And it's my thoughts that the superintendent is not authorized to sign a contract for $1.4 million. The Board of Education is authorized.
I acknowledge I stand accused, and I'm willing to let legal counsel weigh in on that. We'll do that post haste.
So I believe that we need to not accept the grant until that is decided, And if it does turn out, then the board needs to vote whether or not they want to accept the grant, which is really a contract with whoever's making the grant.
If legal counsel comes to that conclusion, I would be very happy to bring that to the board.
I have some additional concerns, but I'll wait and see what Mr. Levy and other people have to say.
Mr. Levy?
Yeah. I want to make crystal clear, I'm not necessarily against this. I'm concerned about how it's implemented. Because I think it's important that we know, that we give our students access to testing, and that we know which students have the disease and need to be out of school and the like. But as a practical matter, are we encouraging parents to send symptomatic children to school just to be tested? That kind of concerns me a little bit.
Okay, so absolutely not. At no time would we ever ask.
No,
we would
I'm not
want-
saying, I'm not saying that believe me, I know we're not gonna ask for that, you know? What I'm saying is, do we have to educate parents on how to properly use the program so that they don't say to their child, well, you got the sniffles today, get on the bus, and when you get to school, ask him to test you.
Yeah, so, and of course, with anything, we're gonna have to share with parents how it works.
Yeah.
So we will share with them that nothing is changing in terms of, you know, if you're symptomatic, you don't come to school, you stay at home. And then this is your process for contacting the school to arrange for a COVID test if you so choose, which would be, again, the parent bringing the child to school and a drive-through type testing.
Now, what is symptomatic? In other words, the child has the sniffles? Is that
It would be
symptomatic?
It would
or-
be the list, the CDC's list that DHHS also uses and our local health department uses that says these are these COVID symptoms. There's a list, it's communicated.
No, I understand that, but let me explain to you my concern. And I don't think it's insurmountable, but there is a concern. What we've tried to do, and what our goal has always been, is to keep children who are ill out of school and away from school, okay? I'm a little concerned that this is going to bring them into the school just for the purpose of testing. But clearly, if you go to your doctor's office or you go to the health department, before you enter, you're gowned, and they do all these things. And we're not really set up to gown people and the like. Do you see what I'm talking about?
I do, and what I would say is this, you know, we will absolutely have a process in place so that parents understand how this testing works, so that they will not just be sending their children to school. We do deal with that every day. Every day we have symptomatic children who are coming to school. I'd shared previously about 1 in 5 of our positive cases were already symptomatic previously at school, you know, before they went and got tested.
That was one of the reasons why we issued a couple of communiques from time to time to remind everybody of that. It's also important to note that we're one of the school districts that's late in the game with testing. Many other school districts, and this has not been their experience, the presence of testing nobody has presented me with any anecdotal information that indicates that this is a pattern that they've experienced. So there's a lot of people much more experienced than us that we'll be taking guidance from as we put together our protocols. It's not that complicated. Our
now
folks are
once-
pretty skilled at it.
Yeah. Now, once a child is tested, does that child go into isolation and have to be sent home with a parent until we get the results of the test?
It works the same way as it would as if they were tested at a doctor's office or a pharmacy. That, yes, until your test results come back, you go home and isolate.
Okay, and well, I'm actually talking about in school. In other words, in practical terms, okay? Child goes to the nurse. the nurse tests the child. And then, we don't know the results, but we do know that we have a child who has been tested and is awaiting results. What happens to that child?
Just like if they were symptomatic and didn't get tested, the parent is on their way to come pick the child up and take them home. It works the exact same way as it does if testing were not involved.
Okay, and we have rooms to isolate children?
Every
in
school has an isolation room and has for the past.
Existing
Year and a half.
protocols
Yeah.
that are already, that have been in place for the last year will apply to this situation. That this doesn't raise the risk level of transmission, because we've already got protocols in place.
Now, we're trying to hire 14 nurses, and I guess it's a fairly difficult thing to get a nurse, I would imagine.
Yeah. We've been pleased. with
Although
the
we've,
response
yeah,
so
we've
far.
been very satisfied with the
Yeah.
response to our,
Right, but we have, what's it, 21, 22 schools?
22 schools.
22 schools, okay. Do we have nurses already in 7 schools, or what's the story? Because you said that the kids could get a test just in any school.
So we have 14 regular Moore County Schools nurses. Okay, obviously, like you said, we have 22 schools. We would love to have 22 school nurses and one in every school. That's not feasible right now. So the plan was to hire 14 additional nurses who would follow the same, kind of the same path as those other school nurses and cover schools. So these testing nurses will cover, some of them will cover more than one school depending on the size of the school. And that would just mean some travel that's involved.
Okay, well, I'm getting a little mixed up. We have how many nurses?
We have 14 regular school nurses.
14 regular nurses, and we're gonna hire 14, that would be 28. And we have 21 schools, so we would have a nurse for each school, am I wrong?
Now, the testing nurse is for testing primarily. So their
Right.
job initially is going to be to make sure testing is accommodated. Once that responsibility is taken care of, then they'll support the school nurse in any of the other school health related needs that they have, such as dealing with positive COVID cases and communicating with the health department in terms of close contacts at school.
Okay, now, the nurses' contracts, how do they read? I mean, is it say for the rest of the school year? or
they're terminating contracts for 1 year,
For 1 year, and those are all within the budget?
within the
Correct.
1.4 million.
That's what I'm talking about.
That's correct.
Point of clarification, Mr. Levy, these are not within the budget that the board voted
No,
on and
I-
approved previously. These are additional, in my opinion, unauthorized expenditures without board approval.
And
But-
again, I stand accused, and we can move on.
All right, but what I'm trying to do is, this is my concern, which is outside of this. I don't want to create a fiscal cliff where we are all of a sudden at the end of our grant.
I would not have authorized, that
No, no, no,
that
I
would definitely
understand.
require school board approval. I wouldn't have had any doubt about that. And so I would not have authorized such a program
No,
in such a case.
My concern is we create the fiscal cliff regardless of what we do. I know it's not intentional.
That's what the original purpose of today's meeting was.
Are there any other, this is something I hope that you will look with council. I'm a little bit concerned about liability, maybe not a lot concerned about.
I'm not at
liability.
all concerned, and I will ask the legal counsel for that. It's a DPI program, or it's a program that the state has made available to the schools, and there are lots of other school districts that have been doing this for quite
Right.
some time, very effectively. We are late in the game, and the question is, why weren't we doing this earlier? And so I think those are some fair questions, too. At this point, I am very proud to be authorizing this. If I've overlooked anything, then, as I said, I stand accused. We will do our homework on that before we get to your next board meeting. And other than that, I'll be honest with you, I don't see any downside to this. It's an optional diagnostic program. Nobody's going to participate in it unless they feel as though they need it and they want it. And it doesn't cost us anything. And it does provide us with another tool that keeps kids in school. Now, relative to the previous question about contact tracing or whatever on keeping kids in school, let me ask you this, Dr. Powers. If a child learns that they have, or a parent learns that their child has been exposed in school and they have to quarantine, does testing enable the quarantine period to be shortened for a child? So if my child's been exposed and quarantined, if I get my child tested, does that shorten the quarantine period?
It does not shorten the quarantine period, so testing does not allow for the quarantine to be ended or shortened.
Okay, I'm going to make sure I bring that up at my next meetings with the ABC Collaborative and with DHHS and DPI. I think that that's wrong-headed, and I think that there's substantial learning experience and learning that we've all had over the last year and a half that would indicate that if this kind of feature is made available, it'd be nice if the board could help me advocate on that, because I think that that's something the state should
And I
consider.
can share this, Dr. Grimacy, at our weekly meeting with the Moore County Health Department yesterday. Mr. Whitman, shared that. I think there is some discussion of that as case numbers go down and everything is trending downward.
Yes,
Not at our local health department, but even above that at DHHS, at the CDC,
right.
that there's some consideration of that as a possible loosening of control measure in terms of testing being a factor related to quarantines.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Powers, I don't know if you stated, what is the turnaround time of the test results? It's not one of the 15 minutes, obviously. It's what, 24?
It is the PCR test, which is the gold standard for for tests, and so, yes, approximately 24 hours.
Okay, okay.
The other thing that I would like to add too is that I did clear this up with ABC Collaborative and with our own health department. I ran this question up the flagpole myself. I'm concerned about the seasonal flu and COVID-19. I wanted to know, how will we know the difference? Because Mr. Levy, you were referencing symptoms, and I was wondering about symptoms because many of the symptoms of COVID-19 are the same symptoms as seasonal flu.
Or even a cold.
Or even a cold, that's right.
Yeah.
But the COVID test is that which sorts it out. As of now, whether we like it or not, nobody gets quarantined for seasonal flu. So if we start to have situations where an individual seems to have flu symptoms, whereas maybe in the middle of August they might get quarantined, would a COVID test, a negative COVID test, help us to sort out the difference between seasonal flu during particularly December through February, and therefore in that way keep certain students and employees from being quarantined when seasonal flu runs its course in about 7 or 8 days. You get back to work or get back to school, maybe even quicker than that in some cases. But with COVID, it's 14 days. Mm-hmm. And so would the diagnostic testing help shorten or reduce the number of quarantines based on the wrong symptoms?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So you have a symptomatic student. If the parent chooses not to test, then it's being presumed that it's COVID, right now where we stand. With testing, when parents get their children tested, and it's a negative PCR test, it's not COVID.
Correct.
Which means no one has to be quarantined related to that child, and it means once that child's symptoms resolve, they return to school, whether that's 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. They're not automatically having to be isolated for 10 days as they would with COVID, or if they were presumed COVID because they don't have a test.
And if I can add to that, that literally just happened to me. So my daughter was sick and had very light flu symptoms. 99 to 100 fever, so it wasn't like a bad fever going on. When we went to the doctor, because it kept going on for 5 days, so I was a little like, okay, this could be COVID. He said that that's the new variant in children, is that low-grade fever, the sore throat, just the very light common flu symptoms. And we got the test, and less than 24 hours, he called me at noon, and we got it done at 6 p.m. that night. She was negative, and he's like, she can go back to school. Now, I wasn't going to bring her because obviously there was 2 more hours or 3 more hours left of school, but it worked just like that. So, and when I called the school to let them know, she said, yeah, just give us the test and we're good to go. So it worked. It was smooth. It worked great. So.
And this just shortens that period of
Yeah,
time.
exactly. Because
Yep.
he said if she did have it, she would have to quarantine for at least 5 more days because we are already on the 7th, almost the 7th day at that point.
So you
Counting weekends.
shortened up the quarantine by almost half.
Yes,
Okay.
yep.
Well, do we know, what's the incubation period, or do you know? I'm not asking you a medical question.
Well, we have experience with it. What's our experience
The
been?
incubation period is 2 to 14 days
2 to 14 days.
for COVID.
Okay, so in other words, if a child was to be symptomatic and then test negative, he still might have the COVID? I have no idea. What does the negative test mean?
Yeah, if it's here's what-
Other than the obvious.
Right. So a negative test means the child does not have COVID at that time. So depending on, and we rely on guidance for our school nurses, obviously, and then also from the health department, they may say, we recommend that based on when the child's symptoms started, that they wait, 2 days, 3 days before they're tested. What's very helpful if you get a negative COVID test, and of course, we won't have the ability to do this at school, but certainly a parent could do this with their health provider with seasonal flu coming. That health provider could also test for the flu. And if you get that negative COVID test, positive flu test, you know it's the flu.
When do we expect implementation?
Our goal, hopefully, would be the week of November 8th.
Yeah, which is pending legal review of Mr.
Correct.
Hensley's question. Yes.
Thank you. I believe you've clarified my questions, and I appreciate Dr. Grimacy. I know I had a lot of questions, and not necessarily saying I'm against anything. I just had a lot of questions, and I appreciate you bring this into the meeting so we can ask those questions, and so that the public can get a better understanding of exactly what's going on.
Thank you, sir.
Are there any further questions?
Mr. Hensley.
I share Mr. Levy's concerns. The first thing I thought of when I heard that we were doing COVID testing in schools is this. We've worked really hard to keep COVID out of our schools. We, for an entire year, we didn't allow visitors, or we didn't, we kept parents out, we this and that. The focus of effort, my understanding, was to keep COVID out of our schools. Then all of a sudden, I learned our schools are going to be COVID testing centers. So you send your child to get tested because you think he or she has COVID. You don't send someone to get tested because you think they're fine. So like Mr. Levy, or at least what I think Mr. Levy said, I think this is going to have a net effect of parents saying, oh, well, Johnny or Jill can just go to school and they'll test them, rather than the parent taking their child to a medical facility and getting them tested. So I think in hindsight, this is going to turn out that we're going to end up having more sick children with COVID going to our schools because it's a testing center. Secondly, this should not be downplayed. $1.4 million is over 1% of our budget. So again, I go back to the authority of the superintendent to accept a grant and approve a contract that's over $50,000. So if If we haven't accepted the grant, that needs to stop pending legal review. If we have accepted the grant, then we still need legal review, but either way, I believe it needs action and approval of this board to accept the grant and make the expenditures. Thank you.
Could I?
Mr.
And
Dennison?
if I could, for the
I-
record, for the record, if I could, Mr. Dennison, I just want to repeat what I said earlier. The concern that parents will start sending their kids to school because, with symptoms because we have testing at school has not been the experience of the many school districts that have done this before us, okay? So we raise it again. We're going to keep repeating it. I'll keep repeating what it is that we know about that experience. And number two, I've already said I stand accused of perhaps getting a little too enthusiastic. To be honest, I can't answer what legal counsel will say, but I have already committed to making this a priority by the end of the day today. I will check on that. And if you're right, then we're going to have to take steps to put the brakes on it. But if you're wrong, we're not going to put the brakes on it, okay? So I'm just going to check with legal counsel and just commit to you that I will follow up on that and take it seriously.
Well, the board may or may not decide to put the brakes on it, but yes, Dr. Grimace, I understand what you said.
That's always the board's prerogative.
Correct.
But until there is a majority vote of the board, there is an authority that the superintendent carries, and I intend to carry that out.
Understand.
And where I might have, because I feel as though this is in such a, this presents such an important benefit for our students and our families and our employees, I don't apologize for being enthusiastic about it, and I will remain enthusiastic. If I need to make a correction based on an oversight with legal counsel, then I'll be very willing to do that because I do respect the rule of law.
And I will just make a comment that we all know, or we have heard, or at least I have, throughout COVID to where, and even before COVID, where in the winter months as flu season would begin, that parents would get up, their child would have some symptoms, they would give them Tylenol and send the child to school. And that's been the case in so many seasons. And even as COVID began, same thing. They'd get up, and I've even heard stories of where when we had folks out front checking for temperature or checking, have you been exposed to anyone with COVID? Well, the child would say, yeah, my aunt had it. And then the mama would say, no, she didn't have it. So we've heard of all of those cases, but I think that this is going to be a great opportunity for our school system.
Well, in addition to providing the testing for our employees who are routinely exposed to a large number of children every day. So it eliminates them needing to go to urgent care in the
Yeah.
afternoon once they've already had a long day at school. It is a bonus just right there. All right, if there are no further.
I cut off Mr. Dennison, I'm very sorry.
Yeah, I have a clarification. When, for the testing program, the parents that want their kids tested, all that's gonna be done outside, correct? They will not be in the schools for the special program where we're gonna have drive-through?
Yes, so if it's a situation where the child is symptomatic at home, and then
Right.
the parent would call the school, and a time would be scheduled for the parent to drive to the school, and someone would come out to the car to test them.
Right, and you said now that we are getting students every day who are coming to school symptomatic, that their parents probably know
That
about.
has been an
Okay.
issue
I didn't-
throughout the school year,
Want to
yes.
clarify this, thank you.
And just one thing. I hope you will tell the parents or send a note to the parents. If you want your child tested, don't send them to school on the bus. In other words, you know, bring them to the drive-through or whatever it is. And secondly, I hope that you're gonna, for these testing things, that we'll have sufficient PPE for our nurses and the like, who are exposed to the child who's being tested, not just before, but after the child's being tested. I have a lot of concerns that we're acting almost like a medical facility, and we're not a medical facility. And that kind of freaks me out. But at least we could take these couple of steps.
Absolutely, and we'll absolutely make sure that that's clearly communicated. And keep in mind that our nurses are around symptomatic students every day. So the same protocols that have been followed over the course of the pandemic will continue to be followed in terms of PPE and them protecting themselves.
I could see us posting a frequently asked questions feature that's similar to what we've done before. That's always been helpful when we've recognized that we have those questions.
All right, I'm just very, 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 very concerned that we'll have we'll have a kid sent in on the bus and say, oh, when you get to school, just go and test. But educating our parents, I think, is very, very important. That's all I'm saying.
Madam Chair, one more clarification. I don't want it to stand that we have this rampant problem with parents sending kids to school with symptoms. We have enough of that happening that we feel the need to remind parents about that. But I want to make it clear, the vast majority of our parents have been extremely cooperative with our staff and our nurses. And frankly, as difficult as our infection rate has been, particularly at the beginning of this year and then right after holidays last year, I can't say enough about the cooperation of our parents and the professionalism of our staff in keeping it from being any worse than it's been. And so, yes, we have enough of that happening that we have to remind our parents, but I want all those parents who have been extremely cooperative and very sensitive to this to know that we recognize and appreciate that cooperation.
And Dr. Grimacy, I understand that, and no one is trying to impugn a parent. As a matter of fact, that's kind of coming out of left field to me. My concern is that we have a lot of parents who need to go to work. Their kid gets up and is sick. It is just a very tempting thing to say, go to school in the bus. I don't think you have COVID, but while you're at it, go ahead and get that test. I think it's just helpful to remind everyone that we are not a medical facility, and I want to underline one thing. Nor do we intend to become a medical facility, I hope. Okay? Our job, our primary job, our core job is to teach reading, math, and the like. And within that, we have certain obligations, and that's to keep everyone safe. And I understand the use of a protocol such as this. Okay? But when we do it, we have to do it with the understanding that we are not a medical facility, nor are we intending to become a medical facility.
All right, further comments?
Let's move on.
All right, thank you, Dr. Powers, Dr. Locklear, Dr. Grimacy. All right, are we ready to move on then to the reason we are actually here?
Yes.
This has been a long-awaited time as we are entering a new budget cycle. Most appropriate for us to take the time to understand more clearly exactly the expenditures of the school. We do have a large budget that runs through and is under the capable hands of our finance officer, Mr. Andrew Cox. And so I believe, Dr. Grimacy,
If I
you're
could,
going
Madam
to
Chair.
take over. And
Well,
then
first I want to
we'll-
offer my thanks to you and Ms. Thompson and Mr. Hensley as our budget liaisons, school board budget liaisons, for assisting Mr. Cox, to a much lesser extent me. Mr. Cox drives the stagecoach, and then I guess I don't want to say I'm riding shotgun, but I'm sort of in the saddle. And then I want to introduce Jenny Patnote, who is our Assistant Director for Finance, who's getting ready to retire. And so we got to make sure she has her moment before the school board to see a little bit about the expertise that she has and the command that she has for the budget process as well. It's Jenny's not one that likes to be out front, but she certainly is one that knows the process, and we're delighted to have her here, especially before she retires. So really, the person that's going to facilitate the discussion today is Mr. Cox. He's going to start out with sort of setting a framework that the Budget Committee has helped with. We've erred on the side of having a little too much information instead of going too short, because the line-by-line budget process has, there's a lot to it. You got to understand how up front. And then after that, we got plenty of time today for lots of discussion and questions among board members. Ultimately, the superintendent has to present a budget to the board in March, and so we can call this, I guess we can call it the kickoff. The budget committee's already been at work for about a month, but this would be sort of the kickoff. So Andrew, if you just get us started, I'll turn it over to you and Chair Carter and contribute where I can.
All right, thank you, Dr. Grimsey, Madam Chair, members of the board. Thank you for recognizing Ms. Pat Node. She is extremely valuable to finance, and we couldn't do what we do without her. So she is very valuable to us, and glad she's here to help with some of the details once we get into the actual numbers. What I want to start out with is kind of a review. Some of you, it may be a review to some of you, it may be new to some of you. Just to talk a little bit about public school finance in North Carolina and specifically in Moore County. So how I want to go over the topics I want to cover are the statutory requirements in North Carolina General Statute, the budget timeline that we have laid out in General Statute, the general sources of revenue, the Uniform Chart of Accounts and its components that are laid out in statutory requirements, how to go about reading budget codes that we have in our general ledger, and then kind of how we manage the budget, a little bit about how we manage the budget, then give you kind of a summary of overall expenditures, and then take a deep dive more into the line-by-line budget review and talk a little bit about the work that the Superintendent's Budget Committee has done and how we got to where we are now with that. So, North Carolina Statute 115C 422 through 457 is what is titled the State Budget and Fiscal Control Act. That is where we get our direction on school finance, which spells out everything from how a budget is to be formatted, the timelines, how cash is handled, the duties of the finance officer in each school district, the types of accounting systems that can be used, and so on. It also provides for the very centralized control over local school boards' fiscal authority, and also lack of flexibility that we have as a traditional public school system. And again, as I mentioned, that general statute, the State Budget and Fiscal Control Act lays out the timeline for the budget that we have to present and have approved each year.
Mr. Cox, with that last part about this, that it lays out the timeline, is ever consideration given in Raleigh for the fact that both our school budgets, and that's across the state, county budgets across the state, all are having to be completed prior to the state ever completing a budget, such that we are flying blind, I guess I might say, in knowing what figures are going to come out of Raleigh in the course of the year? Have they talked about any kind of change in timeline?
I'm not aware of any discussion about changing the timelines.
Because it does make it more difficult.
It does, and that's,
What's
one of the
coming.
slides that, I just want to reiterate, the challenges of the budget process.
And I would also ask Mr. Dennison, is that something that, your committee might, maybe you've looked into it a number of times. I just don't know.
They have a timeline. The budget should be finished by the end of June.
No, but
And they have no desire, and I'll bring that up later when we talk about legislative agendas, but I think we need to let them know, and I would plan on going to the NASBA and having every single board member in North Carolina let them know that this is BS, the way they're doing it.
All right, so the budget timeline and the preparation of the budget for the state budget, they do a 2-year biennial budget cycle. Obviously, the target is June, which is supposed to be done by July, or by July 1. However, most of the time it's later than that, and as you are aware right now, the state has not passed the new 2-year biennial budget for the fiscal year 22-23 cycle at this point. So we are still waiting on our exact dollars and figures for the fiscal 22 year from state, which includes not knowing our overall funding, but also our teachers going to get raises, our classified folks going to get raises, and so on, things like that. We're blind in that, right now, to use a phrase that Chair Carter used. Our local budget that we have to present to the county is done annually. The school district typically works on preparing that from November to February. We typically engage the superintendent's budget committee. We really do a lot of work in January and February leading up to it, and we present the superintendent's proposed budget to the Board of Education in March. The law requires that we do it by May 1, but we do it in March. And then we have to present to the county commissioners as well by May, I think it's May 15th is the date that we have to present to them by. But in working with them, they ask us to present early, so we typically present in April. And then commissioners by law have to approve their budget no later than June 30th, which we know the typical timeline. We present in April. Mr. Vest presents his proposed budget in May, and then the commissioners do act on their budget in the later part of June. The federal budget is also an annual thing, or annual budget. Federal budget's a little different because we're not on the same fiscal year cycle with the state and local governments. The federal fiscal year is October to September 30th. And as a note here, carryover funding is very important, as well as fund balance. We've talked about how we use our fund balance, a minimum part of fund balance, as a cash flow to cover these federal obligations that we have each year, because we have to wait on getting federal funding. So that's a little bit about the state, local, and federal budget timelines. And as Chair Carter alluded to, there are challenges with these timelines. As you're aware, in North Carolina, our local boards of education do not have taxing authority. So we can't raise any revenue, so we're dependent, or we're at the mercy of other folks and their funding decisions. However, by law, we must submit a budget for the upcoming year before we know anything about the amount of monies that we may receive. So we have to go in and plan, here are our anticipated expenditures, here are our anticipated increases, like we do each year, having to guess at what the state's going to do, but we still have to present that budget and finalize our proposed budget before we know any exact funding amounts from state, local, or federal governments. And part of the issue with that is the Board of Education has to make commitments to staff, our teachers by law, before any of this is approved, before any of a budget is finalized. So that's a big challenge that we have with the timelines that are laid out now. So I understand Chair Carter's point of it would be nice if they would change the budget timeline so we would know a little more specific as we go through preparing our budget. It would be very helpful. So our sources of revenue. In fiscal year 21, and we're using the data from fiscal year 21, it's been finalized, so we're not doing any speculation or anything about what may or may not be in a budget. This is finalized fiscal year 21 numbers that we're using here to analyze today. 65% of that budget comes from state funds, almost 23.5% comes from local. Thank you, Dr. Locklear. And 11.6 comes from federal sources.
When you say fiscal 21, are you saying 2021 or 21-22?
I'm saying 2020, 2021, which is
That's right.
fiscal year
Okay.
21.
I wanted to
Fiscal year
be clear.
22 is 21-22.
Well,
Thank you for that question to clarify. I will note here that This excludes our one-time ESSER funding that we got in June of 2021, because they didn't want it to skew the numbers, because it is one-time funding. We didn't have a chance to spend any of it because we got it there, well, very minimal that we were able to spend that we got late in the year. So this does not include the one-time ESSER money that we received late in the year last year. So just want to caveat that and clarify that. And this is typically what you see each year before any of that ESSER money came out, somewhere around that, those percentages. So now I want to talk a little bit about, I mentioned that there's a uniform chart of accounts that's outlined in general statute, or we happen to have one. The Department of Public Instruction has instituted a uniform chart of accounts, which is the uniform accounting system for all North Carolina school districts. So you may ask why we have a uniform accounting system and what it does. Well, what it does, it shows everyone how our allotments are spent. An allotment is an allocation of money that comes down from DPI to us. And so this uniform chart of accounts, we have to code it in a certain way, and we can see how, or you can see how that is spent. The Department of Public Instruction, and I guess I'll skip a couple bullets, but Department of Public Instruction, the General Assembly, the State Budget Office, federal government use this information. DPI gathers it and then reports it out to all these entities and anybody else that may want to see this information. The uniform chart of accounts in our accounting system, the uniform accounting system, is really the only main financial communication between the districts, the official communication between the districts and the State Department of Public Instruction. And what the uniform chart of accounts does in the accounting system, it provides consistency from district to district. So districts can be compared from year to year, or you can compare from year to year because you're using the same accounting structure and the same uniform chart of accounts from one year to the next. So the uniform chart of accounts has 7 components. They are broken down by fund. In our budget code, it's 1 digit. The next component is purpose code, which is 4 digit. The following is program report code, or what we refer to as PRC. So if you hear me say PRC, that is the program report code. It's 3 digits. Our object code is 3 digits. The location code is 3 digits. And then there are local use codes, 1, which is 3 digits, and then local use code 2 is 2 digits. And I say all this because you'll see an actual budget code later on, and just want to caveat what each one of these components are that are in the uniform chart of accounts. And the uniform chart of accounts is designated by DPI, and they say what codes are fund, what are purposes, what are PRCs, what are objects, and what are locations. We do have the flexibility to determine the local use, obviously by the term local use. So now what I want to do is walk through each component and a little bit about each component. So there are 8 funds that we have in our accounting system. Our Fund 1 is a state public school fund. Our Fund 2 is our local current expense fund, which is our money that we get from the county. And I'll talk a little bit more in detail about each one of them as I go through. Fund 3 is our federal fund. Fund 4 is our capital outlay. Fund 5 is our child nutrition. Fund 6 is our Sand Hills Regional Education Consortium SREC. Our Fund 7 is our child care fund. And then Fund 8 is our local special revenue fund. So the State Public School Fund, Fund 1, it shall include appropriations for the current operating expenses of the public school system for monies made available to the local school administrative unit by the State Board of Education. Those are the allocations that we get, or our allotments that come from DPI for state expenses. As I showed you, our state funding on the previous slide, our sources of revenue was right at 65%. And that's typically what it is for most school districts. The state funding is around 65%. You probably heard me mention before that 85 to 90% of your budget is tied to salary and benefits, our staffing resources. And we're no different, and that's the average that you see, around the state. And most funds are prescribed to us as positions, and I'll talk about what a position allotment is, in a few minutes. So what's state funding based on? Just to give you an idea, state funding is based on average daily membership or students that we have. How it's done, to talk a little bit about how it's done, our initial allotments that we get from the state, the very first allotment from the state is based on the higher of our first 2 months of the prior school year. So fiscal year 22's funding is based on the hire of fiscal year 20 students, month 1 and 2, or the projection that DPI does. They take that month 1 and 2 data, they use that as a base, they have a statistician who works with state demographer and so on to get birth rates, in migration, out migration rates for every county, and try to do a projection every year. So when DPI takes those numbers, month 1 or 2 numbers, whichever's higher, they then look at the projection that they came up with, and whichever one of those numbers is higher, that is what they're going to use to fund our next year state district on. It's kind of complicated, but that's the process that they've done for a while. So that's how our state funding is based. So in state funding, we have positions. So what does a position mean? So the state gives us a position and will pay for that position or a person in that position regardless of what the cost for that position is. So they give us 10 months of employment for a teacher. We don't have to employ one teacher for 10 months, as it says here. You could have, you could pay 10 teachers for 1 month out of this position allotment. So you do have a little flexibility there, but they give us 10 months, 10 months of employment is 1 FTE, and that's a typical teacher's year, and that's why they give you 10 months. So as it says here, so a full-time state-paid teacher in a position allotment with 5 years' experience costs the same to an LEA or a local education agency, school district, as a state-paid teacher with 25 years. They're both one position. The state picks up the cost for that regardless of the years of experience. It doesn't cost us any more or less when we fund through positions. Here are the classifications that we are given for state positions. Our classroom teachers, our school building administration, our principals, assistant principals, our instructional support, which typically are media guidance, instructional coaches here in Moore County, and then our career technical education teachers. Those are your categories that we get months of employment for, and the state will cover the cost regardless of the years of experience for those employees. The next component of state funding is dollar allotments. So DPI says, okay, we're going to give you $5 million in this category, for example, and we have to live within that dollar allotment for that specific category. And some of those, just examples of some of those categories are teacher assistants, textbooks, classroom materials, instructional supplies and equipment, central office administration, school technology, and our vocational education or career technical education programs. So these are funded as dollar allotments, and we must live within those total dollar allotments that were given for those classifications. The next area of allotment that the state gives to school districts are what we call categorical allotments. These are, they're also dollar allotments, but they're given for specific programs. And as you see here, some examples of those are your academically and intellectually gifted students, your at-risk students or alternative school programs, your children with disabilities, your limited English proficiency programs, driver's ed and transportation, or some of your categorical allotments that we have, that we get money in those specific pots that have to be spent on those specific programs. Can't be spent on anything else. Through state funding, we are able to do some conversions. Our Restart schools are one of those conversions that we're allowed to do. The state mandates a per pupil expense that we have to convert at each Restart school. What we do, we have to take our month 2 average daily membership as reported to DPI, and then we have to multiply that times that per pupil amount that DPI establishes, and come up with what we call a discretionary conversion, where we look at the allotments that DPI has given us in our positions, our dollar categories, and then we determine how we can best utilize those conversions to generate additional revenue for those Restart schools. And then we do the conversion at that factor. One of the advantages of the conversions at Restart schools, we do it at the state average, or the LEA average, where any other conversion that the state allows you to do, I say other conversions are prohibited or limited. You can do other conversions, but you have to do that at the beginning teacher's salary, which is typically less and would be at a loss to the district when we do a conversion. So most districts do not do that anymore. I believe it was 2012, they changed the general statute on that to take away conversion at the average teacher salary and move it down to the beginning teacher salary, which took a lot of flexibility and dollars away from school districts when they did that. Another category of conversions that we do are international faculty exchange, which DPI refers to as IFE. It used to be called VIF, or Visiting International Faculty. There is a company that used to be called VIF, which is the reason that DPI changed to IFE, because they don't want to unintentionally influence people to use VIF, the VIF company, to bring teachers, when there were several other companies that could provide those that had been approved and gone through the vetting process. That conversion, these teachers are on approved contract through the vendor. They're typically hard-to-staff areas, dual language programs. Spanish immersion program up at Robbins is a good example of where we have some of those teachers, IFE teachers, and it covers the salary, fees, and insurance for those teachers. So that was a little bit about the state public school fund and how that works. The local current expense
Mr.
fund.
Collins, wait, let's stop and see if anybody has any questions. So far, so we've looked at state funding and the restrictions and or prohibitions that are placed upon quite a few of the funds, as well as the very few areas where you can have some flexibility. So are there questions about this? We have 3 Restart schools in Moore County, which we know there has been some flexibility provided to those schools. I know they've been able to repurpose a position, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but along those lines. So if anybody has any questions at this point about state funding, we ought to take just a quick breath and see if there need to be asked.
Do we get to designate which ones of our teachers are state and which ones are local? Do we get to designate that to the state?
Yes, sir. And what we do, and I may have it here later on, I'm not 100% sure if I have it in here or not. What we do, we try to utilize and maximize the state dollars by having our most experienced teachers, our highest costing teachers, costing for lack of better terms, paid to those state positions, so it will not cost us any additional money. The newer teachers, lower paid teachers, would then, if we don't have positions from the state to cover them, be funded through our local dollars.
And could you, once again, I was a little confused, can you define a conversion?
So in the terms, the conversion that we talk about here is what you take a position and then you convert that to dollars that come to the district. And then the district will use those dollars for expenditures. So for example, like at Restart, I can take one teacher position and convert at the LEA average salary, and then I take that money to pay a Restart teacher at the Restart school. If there is a beginning teacher at the Restart school that costs $35,000, I converted at the LEA average $46,000. I just made the district and that school $11,000.
Okay.
But that conversion money is then used at the Restart school.
Yes, yes, it's used to support those Restart schools,
And
yes.
it could be used for, what, a part-time teacher assistant, or,
So, Dr. Locklear's team would determine and work with those schools on how to best utilize and come up with strategic initiatives that they feel like could best move that school forward. But it can be used for pretty much anything.
An extra
Because they have the
reading
charter-like
program or-
flexibility where we're not limited, because I've converted that now from a position to dollars that we can use.
Madam Chairman, the staff has presented to the school board previously about the net benefit of that. Dr. Locklear and Mr. Cox, I'm going to put you on the spot, but just ballpark, refresh the board's memory on about how much money did our schools benefit from, the Restart schools? Ballpark, kind of, what was the net
So-
effect of conversion in the past year?
So last year was our first year doing the conversion, and we netted roughly $300,000 to $400,000 for those schools,
Across all those schools or per school?
across those schools.
Okay.
And we broke it out evenly, because although you have to take the ADM of each school, it's not given to, the state doesn't give it to each school, so it's one big pot for those 3 schools to use. So whatever money we generate, we spread it out amongst those 3 schools evenly for them to use.
and last year was our first year to be able to do this, because it was our first year with the Restart schools.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And I do know our international faculty was put on hold a year ago, I guess, with the pandemic, and there were not so many admissions, but Dr. Locklear will know, not as many teachers were allowed within the country, is my understanding. Because it's made it difficult to find folks
Yes,
who
ma'am.
are able to teach a foreign language.
That is correct, Madam Chair. Robbins especially, Robbins Elementary had to work through some innovative ways to cover some things while some folks were in transit from their countries into Robbins. And so that was a more of an issue last year than it is presenting this year.
All right, any other questions about state funding? The explanation of conversions is very helpful. All right, then let's move on.
All right, so our local current expense fund is our local dollars that we get from the county. It should include the appropriation sufficient when added to the state public school fund for the current operating expenses of the public school system. And it also has to be done within the financial resources consistent with the fiscal policies of the Board of the County Commissioners. And typically, county appropriation will be approximately 25% of a local school district's budget. So what some of the examples and things that we have in our local current expense fund are personnel to meet underfunded or unfunded state mandates, to maintain current pupil-teacher ratios, and then to support, additional assistant principals above our state allotments, where we feel, that it's beneficial to those schools. Funding to support technology, infrastructure, staffing are examples, instructional supplies, athletics, extracurricular activities. A big one here is funding to support our maintenance operations, personnel, minor repairs and upkeep that our Moore County Schools maintenance staff are able to do, and then our fuel costs and utilities there. Transportation. There are some transportation expenses. I say here, not everything can be paid for by the state. The state does allow you to use state dollars to pay for certain things, but when you use those state dollars, when they do your efficiency rating and calculations for the next year, they will back those certain things out and not give you those state dollars. So if we pay for it out of local dollars, then the state's not backing those amounts out when they do those efficiency rating and calculating the budget for your next year.
And that's just for transportation.
That's just for transportation, yes,
Yeah,
sir.
just gotta
That's
make that
correct.
clear.
Yep, yep. Local salary supplements to help try to make Moore County schools competitive for salaries. And then, as you're aware, charter school flow-through payments come out of our local current expense fund that the county appropriates to us. Federal funds, they typically comprise 7 to 10% of a district's budget, you know, and typically rarely what we do down here or advocate for. Little of that changes what happens in Washington. Our numbers stay relatively close to the same each year, 7 to 10%. One thing about federal funds, as you see here, most of the requirements or rules or regulations come down through the federal government. They're very strict on the requirements that we have. And the federal funds are intended to supplement, and we cannot supplant or be used for basic education purposes. They've got to supplement our state and local dollars that we have for their programs. And it is very easy to run into compliance audit issues with federal funds if your staff is not on top of things. And we do have a very good federal program staff here in Moore County Schools who do a great job with that. And some examples of our federal dollars, your Title I, Title II, Title III, and Title IV are prime examples. And then this year, your ESSER I, ESSER II, and ESSER III, the additional one-time fundings that the federal government has appropriated in relation to COVID, in response to COVID. Our next fund, Fund 4.
Andrew, before we move too fast, because of ESSER, the percentage of federal funds at the end of last year was 14%, or is it projected to be 14% this year?
The percent will go up. I'm not sure what the percentage is.
Yeah, but that's unusual, and
but
it's
it
not
will-
expected to continue.
Correct, because it is one-time funding.
Right.
That's why when I showed the sources of revenue, I backed out the ESSER funding so it wouldn't show that anomaly of the one-time funding there. But yes, it is one-time funding, and it will go up because of that. But it is rare, yes. Fund 4 is our capital outlay fund, which is our major capital projects. These are things that are typically done through outside vendors that are too big or more complex than our maintenance staff want to handle. Typically your roof replacements, your heating and air upgrades are examples of things that are paid for out of your capital outlay fund. Our child nutrition fund is an enterprise fund which covers our operations of the child nutrition program, and by enterprise, it is reimbursed through the federal government at a per meal reimbursement rate that we get. Not all costs are fully funded. So what I mean by that is the reimbursement from the federal government may not cover the full cost of the child nutrition program or the full cost of preparing those meals. And there has been a COVID impact as well, because we were doing additional things during COVID, putting meals on buses and delivering out to communities and things like that. So there are additional costs that the child nutrition program couldn't cover, but there were additional revenues from other sources that helped cover that. I also want to mention changes over the last few years. A new child nutrition director came in. We had been operating at a deficit, but over the last few years, we have now, on a annual basis, are operating in the black, where we're not having to use any other local funds to help offset the cost of the child nutrition program. One thing the local does have to cover, regardless, is any outstanding meal debt where someone has not paid for their meals and have a debt to the school for those meals. By law, the district has to cover those costs. So that's really the only place where the local has to pick up that cost. I will caveat that during the COVID pandemic, all children, regardless of whether they were typically free or reduced or full paid, are able to get free meals. So all children are able to get free meals. So there has not been the outstanding meal debt last year because of that. And we are continuing, I believe, to the end of this year, they have approved free meals for all students to the end of this school year. Then we'll look to see what happens going forward from there.
Just to comment on that, I think it's going to be a real shock. I think I said this to you the other day. All these families that have become accustomed to our free breakfast and free lunch this last year are going to want that to continue the next year. I don't know what our actual food services budget is, but just in talking with my 2 kindergarten-age granddaughters, I said, do you eat school breakfast? Oh, yeah. She said, they give us breakfast at school every day. And, you know, they came out of daycares where they arrived at school or arrived at the daycare each morning and were given breakfast. And it's just routine to them to continue to do that same thing. So, I know it's an incredible expense, but as we forge ahead over the next fiscal year, it's going to be something that's really missed by a lot of families, especially our families that don't qualify for free or reduced lunch, but may still be having problems stretching the budget. So I have appreciated the federal government and the funding of the free breakfast and lunch for this last COVID time, but certainly do wish it was something that would continue.
You know, and I selfishly appreciate this because I have a daughter in first grade. Last year, she was in kindergarten through the Connect program, so she stayed home, so we didn't take advantage of that. But now she's actually in school, going in person, and so we have taken advantage of those free meals. So I definitely appreciate that, you know, from a selfish perspective. And, you know, hopefully something will be able to continue. And we did some initial preliminary numbers in talking with Ms. Lovelady, and we estimate it will cost minimum around $2 million additional. And John, do you remember what the up to amount was?
It was at a broad range because it depended on participation primarily. Oh, I'm sorry. It had a broad range because that would depend on participation, but I think the high end, Andrew, was somewhere around 1.8 or 1.9.
I thought that the low was about 1.9,
Up
up to about 5, up to 3, okay.
3 million,
Okay.
up to 3 million.
To do universal meals in Moore County. But factors, like John mentioned, where participation rates would be a key in determining what the actual cost would be.
Madam Chair, I'd recommend we keep moving. We want to get Mr. Cox through this framework, and then you can pick and choose whatever topics you want to drill down on
I
later.
got
Yeah.
more questions.
Yeah, I know you do. If we could keep moving, as you know, there's a lot to cover here.
All right, so our Fund 6 is our Sand Hills Region Education Consortium, or SREC. We serve as the fiscal agent for them, so no funds are expended by us for the SREC. As it says there, no district dollars are used to pay for SREC obligations. We do charge indirect costs to the SREC for serving as fiscal agent, which that's essentially paying us for being their fiscal agent and having them on our books. Yes, sir.
If I could take a point of privilege here, I want to follow up on something that the superintendent said. And this could be a very short, productive day, or this could be a very, very long day. And I think it's important that we define exactly what our mission is here today, and I think we need to do it now. And here's why. These financials that we're going to go over are a remarkable tool, right? I mean, there's just going through here, there's just so much information that we need to know, the public, and it brings up all kinds of questions. But it's my understanding that the purpose of this meeting is to go through the process and define the financials and, familiarize everyone with them, make sure everybody understands the chart of accounts and the cost centers and how they're set up. And that mission will take a couple hours, I would think, right? Now, and that's my understanding, the mission of this meeting. That's what we're trying to accomplish here today. If we want to dive into each and every line item and discuss the merits of free meals versus unfree meals and what that's going to cost, we're going to be here till next Saturday, right? So my suggestion is, if the other board members agree, is that we refrain from getting into, I mean, you can use something as an example, like, this is valuable because you can compare this to that. But if we as board members attempt to drill into any single line item today, I've done a lot of budget reviews. I've done a lot of financial reviews. That's a 3-day process. So does anyone have any observations on that?
I have to pick up my kid at 3:30, so I'm all about it.
You need to speak close to your mic.
I was gonna say, I had to pick up my child at 3:30, so I'm all about what you
And
just said.
I would concur that in
me
our,
as
in the
well.
staff's work with the budget
Yeah.
committee, I would concur that that's been our understanding in assisting with putting this together today. Thank you, Mr. Henson.
And then once we understand it, then we make sure everyone understands it and the public understands it as well. And this information's online, and I applaud everyone for putting, this is amazing transparency. Then you can go home and study it, and then we can follow up with questions like, hey, why is this, and this and that, so.
All right, so the next fund that we have is our child care fund. This is payroll flows through finance. It's for internal control purposes. Schools cannot pay personnel from their local school accounts. They have to flow through finance. The school covers the expenses through fees that they charge for the child care. There are no district funds used to cover the child care. And it is a school-based decision on multiple factors of whether they provide child care or not.
Is the child care a public thing, or is it just for our employees?
It's both. Both.
It was on.
Sorry, I'm struggling with the mic here. It's both. It's offered to our staff as an opportunity for them, but if there's any additional seats past staff, it's open up to the public.
But it's primarily for our staff.
It serves, I would say, the great majority of seats in our daycare programs, which we only have 3 of those, to my knowledge. I can double
Three
check that.
programs or 3 seats?
3 programs. We have a program at Medici Creek, we have a program at Bass Lakeview, and we have previously had a program at Carthage that was paused during COVID. I'd have to circle back and see exactly where we are right now. But those are the 3 programs we've had for daycare in our school system. There's a difference between daycare and pre-K.
No, I
And, so
understand.
just want to make sure that's clear.
Pre-K ends at about 2 o'clock, but daycare is, I guess, till 5 or whatever it is.
Mhm.
Well, just to be clear, you're referring to all-day daycare.
Yes, sir.
There is much more pervasive after-school daycare.
Yes.
You see that in,
I'm simply talking about daycare. I'm not talking about like boys and girls clubs, and there are also other after-school care, but I'm talking about daycare particularly.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
All right, so our Fund 8 is our other special revenue fund, and some examples of things that go in there are our Medicaid reimbursements, our impact aid funding, our ROTC funding, NC pre-K, is there, and then other direct grants that we may receive go into the other special revenue fund, things that do not come or flow through DPI there. So that's the first component of the chart of accounts, are the funds. These others will go a little bit quicker because I'm not going to go into each one of them because there's so many parts of them. But I will just generally cover my purpose codes include activities or actions that are performed to accomplish the objectives of a local school administrative unit. They're grouped into 5 categories. Your instructional services, your system-wide services, your ancillary services, your non-program charges, and then your capital outlay. Just to give you a few examples of those, your 5,000 are instructional service or cost dealing directly with interaction between teachers and students. Some examples are 5110 regular curricular, 5120 CTE curricular, and you see there some of the other ones. Our 6,000 are system-wide codes, are cost of activities, providing system-wide support for school-based programs. And the examples there are 6110 regular curricular and development, 6200 special population support and development, and then 6400 our technology support services. Our 7,000 code are ancillary services, our activities not directly related to the provision of education for our pupils, which are our 7,100 community services, which are our child care, and then our 7,200, which are your school nutrition services. Your 8,000 non-programmed are typically your conduit transfer type payments. 8,100 payment to other governmental units, 8,200 unbudgeted, and 8,400 interfund transfers. Our 9,000 is our capital outlay expenditures requiring fixed assets, improvement of grounds, and purchase of equipment. So that was the purpose. I told you I'd be moving quickly now on that. Our program report code structure designates a plan of activities or funding designed to accomplish a predetermined objective. Some examples of our program report codes are 001, our classroom teachers, 002, central office administration, 007, instructional support, 027, teacher assistants, 032, children with disabilities, and 056 is the transportation of pupils. That's your to and from school transportation there in 056. So our object codes now. The next component is a service or commodity obtained as a result of a specific expenditure. There are 5 categories, typically of those, which are our 100 level object codes are salaries, our 200 level object codes are benefits. Your 300 level are purchase services, your 400 level are your supplies and materials, and then your 500 level object codes are typically your capital outlay. And then here's just a few examples of the different salary object codes that we have. And I will mention that in the executive summary that was sent out, you have access to the DPI's full definition of purpose codes, all the PRC codes, and the definition of each object code as well that was sent out to the board members with the agenda and executive summary there. So some salaries, 114 principal, 121 classroom teacher, 142 teacher assistant, 200 is your 211 FICA, 221 retirement, 231 hospitalization. Purchase services are 311 are your contracts, 321 your utilities, electric, and then 324 waste management, 400 level your 411 supplies materials, 418 computer software, 423 gas or diesel fuel. And then in the 500 level capital outlay, 522 your general contract, 523 HVAC, 541 purchase of equipment. Again, these are just examples just so you can see what may fall in the grouping of object code. So your location code is now the school or the district location code. Some examples here are 000, which is your district-wide, which is attributed to all schools. 308 is Aberdeen Elementary, 331 is New Century Middle, 332 is Northmore High School. And I'll also mention, in part of what was sent out to the board, we have a listing of all locations for your information. And again, this is just an example of location codes.
When you, I did notice that on your location codes, when you do a 000, it's basically expended at the county headquarters? Is that what it is?
It's expended at the county headquarters, but it's for all the schools. So it may be a program that impacts all elementary schools or all middle high schools. So it's coded as 000 because it is a district-wide expense for all schools. But it is done through our finance office centrally here.
It's fair to say 000 is the default. When it doesn't relate specific to a school site, it's multiple sites. Unless you break it down into an ADM distribution.
Correct, yes, sir.
000 is the default.
Then we have some local use 1 and 2 codes, which are department level or grant level. Just some examples for local use 1 is 535 transportation, 610 maintenance. Then our local use 2, it really varies because 01 could be used in multiple places, and it may mean different things. So that's why we say it's varies. So it's really hard to capture that local use 2 in a general format, but we could tell you if once you get to that level, what it really is for that specific situation. So now that we've gone through the components of the Uniform Chart of Accounts, I'll help us learn to read a budget code that we have in our financial system. Again, just to reiterate, it's a fund, purpose, PRC, object, location, local use 1, and then local use 2. So if we see a 15110 001 121 308 510 00 as the budget code, you know that that's using state funds, regular curricular program, classroom teacher program report code, or POT, for a classroom teacher at Aberdeen Elementary School and its payroll. A next example is 15210 032 133 376 510 00. Again, it indicates it's state funding. It's for exceptional children out of the exceptional children's pot for a psychologist at Westmore Elementary through payroll. Now, Westmore doesn't have a psychologist designated specifically to them. So if that psychologist serves 3 schools, for example, it would be a third of that position. But this just gives you an idea of how that account could be. It's not necessarily, doesn't have to be a full FTE. It could be broken down into multiple FTE for the same person, depending on what they're doing. And then the last example that I have here, 25110 300 411 316 316 00, is our local current expense fund from the county commissioners, again for our regular curricular programs, using our district school funds, what we refer to as district school funds that we give out to the schools for supplies and materials at Carthage Elementary. So that's how you would go about reading a budget code if you saw one that we have in our general ledger. Pause for any questions you may have at this point.
Okay, so any questions or comments?
All right,
Seeing none,
if
forge
not,
ahead.
I'll keep moving. All right, so for the process that we have for managing the budget, I'll start at the high level. DPI typically allots our state funding and our federal funding. And just so you know, last year we had over 50 allotment revisions that came down from the state. So what does that mean? That means that there were 50 times that DPI change the amount of funding that the district had during the year. That could be an increase of funding, or it could be a decrease of funding, depending on what the circumstances are. Allotments,
It could be the state's approval of its budget in the month of November.
it could be where
I'm
they're,
just saying.
where they are truing up the numbers that they had preliminarily given you at the beginning of the year. That is absolutely correct, Dr. Grimsey. So allotments don't typically come until a state budget is passed. DPI does not typically allot things out to us until a state budget is passed. However, because things have drug on so long, they have started implementing preliminary numbers, so it won't harm districts, so they'll have some allotments out there, an idea, although they're not final numbers, but they've started giving out preliminary numbers just so school districts can operate, because they know that the state budgets have been taking so long to pass. And the issue with that is if they don't allot state funds first, by law, they have to allot state funds first. And if they don't allot the state funds, they can't allot anything else. So that's why they have taken the approach to allot a preliminary number so they can get meet the statutory requirement to get state funds out, and then they can start allotting these federal programs. Because if they did not, we wouldn't have access to our ESSER dollars right now. Because those are federal dollars, and by law, they have to allot out state dollars first. Right now, we are operating under a continuation budget resolution.
So we're operating on last year's budget.
Yes, sir. We're essentially operating on last year's budget, or the last budget numbers that we have, because we had
talking
many
about-
budgets.
I'm not talking about us, I'm talking about the state.
Yes,
in
correct.
allotting money, right?
Yes, correct. Yep. So that's why they're preliminary numbers. And I'll go ahead and put this out there. You know, teachers, classified staff have asked, why haven't we seen a raise this year? Because we have no authority to increase or change their salary at this point, because the state is under a continuing resolution.
Wait a second. We approved a classified raise, was it earlier this year?
So we implemented the classified salary
That was
scale
implemented, okay,
because we use local dollars to make up that difference.
okay, all
Yes.
right, that's what I
Yes.
wanted to make sure.
So we
Yeah.
did implement the
Yeah.
classified
Yeah.
salary scale.
Yeah.
All right.
No teachers have moved up a step
Yeah.
on the salary schedule, and no other employee that is paid on a step scale has moved up this year, because the state does not have the authority to allow us to expend any more on salaries than what we did last year. Through state resources, through state dollars.
All right, I just want to make sure
Yeah.
that they got the money that we had allotted.
That is
Cool.
that is correct. I would, since this came up and trying to stay within the guardrails that Mr. Hensley articulated earlier, which I, agree with. But just to make sure that, because of this conversation, we don't have the unintended consequence of creating a problem. Clarify what happens to remedy this. Once the state approves a budget, we have some precedent in the past where the state waited until October to approve a budget. We are now getting past that point. So what's going to happen with these folks to make it right once their raises are
Yeah,
approved?
so what happens, once a state budget is passed, whatever the increase is, typically, it is retroactive back to July 1, the beginning of the year. So those employees would see that money, once we know what it is, we have to do calculations of the difference, and then they would get a retroactive payment effective July 1. That is, if the General Assembly puts it in that it is effective July 1. The General Assembly has to do that, and most likely they will.
That's been their practice.
That's been their practice.
Will that be a one-time payment?
That will be a one-time payment because it's a retroactive payment, and then they will be moved to that new salary amount for the remainder of the year.
Okay, so then the last potential unintended consequence of this conversation that I want to make sure there's no confusion on, if the General Assembly doesn't approve a budget into December or January, there's a tax impact for individuals. If they don't get that check retroactive to July 1, they receive it after January 1. Is that or is that not an issue at this point?
And when you say an issue, it is a tax?
Is it possible that they may not get that check until after January 1?
Yes, depending on when the state budget is passed, yes.
Okay, so for that purpose, as advocates for our employees, we really want to be conveying to our representatives, our senator and our governor, to please get this done, because that's really, it could be an issue for some employees who don't get that check until the next tax year.
Right.
Unless there's a way that we can coach them around the tax implications.
And then it would increase their
of it.
tax liability.
All right. I mainly wanted to convey that the board and the staff are aware of this, so in case it comes up in a conversation, people know that we are attending to it.
And
Okay,
one
that's it.
last question. We have certain classified employees which we pay as opposed to the state, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Are we prepared to give that retroactive increase to the people who we employ? And do we have any idea of what that's going to be and how that's going to impact our bottom line? Are we able to do it? Are we planning for it?
So we plan for increases in the superintendent's proposed budget and the budget that the board approved. So yes, we are prepared to do that.
Okay, again, clarify, are there employees that know they're locally funded and know
No.
the state? Okay, so.
Most employees do not know which source of funds they are paid from.
So all classified employees are taken care of. The issue of how the state and local dollars are used is on us.
It is, correct.
That's not anything for them to lose any sleep over.
Correct.
So
They typically do not know
all the
source
conversations
of
about
funding.
retroactive pay have to do with certified employees, that are covered in the state budget. But as far as our classified employees are concerned, what is there for them to worry about?
There's nothing for them to worry about, but if the state does pass a pay increase, a
Right.
pay raise, effective July 1, they would get a retroactive payment just like
If
anybody
that
else.
pay raise gets it over and above our local classified salaries.
Correct, yes,
So what
correct.
we would have to make them whole on, Mr. Levy, would be as if there's a state raise for classified employees that takes their raises above what they've already received.
Oh, I don't doubt that, but I just want to make sure that we're planning to have the money
Correct.
to do it.
Yes, sir.
So, it's really, has nothing to do with them worrying about it. I'm just worried about our physical bottom line, and, we've got many things to pay.
Understand.
And this could be a chunk of money.
Yeah, there's nothing for them to be concerned
No.
about. They're gonna be made, if there's any difference, they're gonna be made whole. I just wanna make sure this conversation doesn't unnecessarily create
Right.
any concern on their part.
Mr. Cox, to add to that, I know that you have that long-range vision that sets aside a certain amount each year. And that's one reason we sometimes at the end of the year end up with a surplus unexpectedly when the state doesn't fund a salary increase. Then we end up with some funding.
Correct. That's a good example of why you may have a surplus at the end of a year, where we went into budgeting. We budgeted 3% for a raise, for example, and the state gave 1% or gave nothing. And so we had budgeted for 3% for all employees, including our local, because they don't know what the source of funding is. And then because they didn't pass as high as what you budgeted for, you may have a surplus at the end of the year. That's a great example of that.
It's not because money just didn't get, well, it is because money didn't get spent, but it's because the state didn't give that raise that had.
And we had
that
planned for a
anticipated.
higher raise than what they actually
Okay.
passed.
And there is a
Right.
slide on fund balance coming up, on how you manage fund balance, correct, at the end? You don't need to answer that.
That'll be part of the original budget presentation
Okay, I got my two
in
presentations.
November.
Okay.
That's what I wanted to double check on that, yeah.
But if you go back and look at the last, even budget presentations, I don't know, ever since Mr. Cox has been here, there's always a set-aside amount in the event that the state budget ever gets passed and raises are implemented.
That's part of the issue with the budget timeline that we talked about. We have to anticipate or project what the state may do, set that money aside, and hope we're close to that. Because we have to also pay those locally funded folks the same thing that the state pays, because again, they don't know what the source of funding is for their position. That's what we manage internally. to try to maximize those dollars.
And so as much as we would like for all employees to get, say, a 5% raise, if that were to happen, we would come up short.
Right.
Because that's just not the traditional implementation. So
Right.
we count on Mr. Cox to be, and Dr. Grimacy to be on target in setting aside that funding.
And we do typically try to look at historical numbers when we're projecting out what we bring as part of the budget.
And this also needs to be communicated to the county, county finance office. Because sometimes they look at our fund balance and they say, well, you guys have a lot of money. But it's money that we have now but needs to be spent later, and also needs to be kept as a contingent fee for whatever the state decides to do 6 months into our fiscal year.
And I will say we will continue to do that, because we have been doing that.
No,
Yeah,
no,
and we
I
do, yes,
understand.
sir.
We can surely say that we've been very clear on that, and so we'll continue to do that. Mr. Cox?
All right, so just one more, or a couple more things on the process for managing the budget. Some allotments are given to us as percentages. For example, Title I, we don't get our whole allotment amount at the beginning of the year. We get a percentage of that. Again, that's the reason, the importance of having fund balance to cover those federal commitments before we get the full amount of funding from the federal government. And then, just so you know, and I believe Mr. Levy has asked this question previously before, allotments are not money in the bank. What that means is they give us access to the dollars. Once we have the expenditures, or we plan to have the expenditures, we typically have 3 days within that time frame to request those dollars from the state, which includes their state and federal monies that come down through DPI. So when we know we're going to have payroll, Ms. Patnode gets a report from our payroll side. They have about how much that payroll is going to be for that month. She'll request that in advance, so once payroll date hits, those checks go out. That money is in our bank to cover our obligations. But we don't have that money in our bank until we know what our expenditures are, and we request that from the state.
So just an important question, since earlier we learned Ms. Patnode is going to retire, and we just now learned that Ms. Patnode makes sure that money's transferred to cover the payroll. I just want to make sure we have that important function covered upon Ms. Patnode's retirement.
It will be covered upon her retirement, thankfully, and I'm very appreciative to her. She has given me a good bit of time to plan for her departure, so hopefully we'll be able to get someone in before she departs. If not, I'll start ditching Dr. Grimacy and staying over in the finance trailer more to do more of the behind-the-scenes stuff.
Yeah, since Mr. Cox is the one who is most impacted by that change, I think we can all be assured he's going to take it very seriously. And also, we've got we've been very fortunate. My entire 7 years here, there's always been somebody ready to step up in finance. And then we've had good bookkeepers in the schools that have then kind of moved in. And every now and then we get somebody from the outside, but we are very blessed to have very capable individuals.
Exactly.
And Jenny's been part of that. She's without getting too off the beaten path here, but since Jenny's in the spotlight today a little bit, Jenny does a great job of training and nurturing that next generation of individuals that are capable of stepping up. So won't miss an opportunity to compliment her.
Thank you, Dr. Grimsey, I appreciate that.
All right, so additional processes for managing the budget. We meet monthly with budget managers, our department heads, who have budgets to make sure they're on track, to find out if they need additional resources or are projecting that they're going to have additional monies that they may not need, that another program may need. That results in budget transfers and reviews from those meetings. Mr. Levy asked about conversions. These are payroll adjustments. And then he asked about, not exactly sure how he asked, but we talk about maximizing those state dollars and putting our most experienced teachers on state. So if if one of those teachers leaves, we bring in a new teacher, we're not gonna put that new teacher on state, now we're gonna have to do an adjustment and move somebody else on state, and then that new teacher would go to local or some other source of funds. So that's what's meant there by our payroll adjustments. We talked about the conversions previously where allowed. I have here the new reduced funding from state, federal, or other grant sources. That goes back to those 50-plus allotment revisions that the state did last year. And all this work culminates in budget adjustments that are brought to the board quarterly through our quarterly budget resolution, amended budget resolution process. So all this work here on this slide culminates in us bringing those quarterly budget resolutions, amended budget resolutions to the board for review and approval.
And Andrew, typically, how often do you meet with our county manager? Because I know there's a lot of collaboration between, is there like a set? I mean, is it like monthly? But, I mean, I know you provide them with information ongoing,
So-
but is that something set with the budget process?
So I do not meet with the county manager on
Okay.
a set schedule.
Okay.
I do communicate regularly with their budget manager,
Okay.
depending on different things.
Okay.
We communicate as things are needed. What was the other question?
I'd say it's pretty seamless. You provide reports and
Yeah,
and they
reports.
get back,
Thank you.
they get
Right,
back
right.
to you with questions. It's
Okay.
not that there's a need for a big,
Okay.
high noon meeting every month. I think it's pretty seamless, working
the-
relationship that we have with them. We know what they want, that we know, we deliver it, they have questions, they ask.
Okay.
And it's a very good relationship that we have.
All right, so just to give you an idea of what the expenditures were, the different categories for using our object codes, the 100, 200, so on that we talked about. The expenditures for 2020, 2021, 61% were salaries alone, 24% were for employee benefits. So you see right there, 85%. We're right there where those previous slides that are typically 85 to 90%. Your purchase services, which are typically your contracts, as I said, was 5%. And some of those are personnel. In our EC area or different things, so that could even bump up your personnel costs a little bit there. 7% was spent on supplies and material, 1% was on capital, and 2% was on the charter school transfers. That just gives you an idea of how we spent the dollars. And just to give you an idea of the full-time personnel by category, and this is a category that DPI sets through what they call an SS200 report that has to be reported to them once a year every October. Excuse me. 3.3% were our school building administrators, which are your principals and assistant principals. 0.5% were your central office administrators, which is senior staff. Your other classified was 22.3%, which are your bookkeepers, your data managers, other folks in the school that don't require a DPI certification, our maintenance staff, director of maintenance, school nutrition staff, make up that 22%, our technology folks. And then the 73.9% includes our teachers, our instructional support, and our teacher assistants. These are folks, our instructional support folks that are included here are those that require a DPI certified license. So Dr. Locklear's curriculum staff that have a license, your Donna Gephardt would be an example of somebody who is instructional support that is included in here. Your media specialists are included there. So that gives you kind of a breakdown of the staff based on the state's definition of personnel through their SS200 report that's submitted each year during October. So now for the process for the line-by-line budget review that we did. There are over 11,000 individual lines and expenditures in our general ledger for fiscal year 21. What we did, we met with the superintendent's budget committee twice in person, had some emails back and forth outside of those timelines. Superintendent's budget committee suggested a format for what we'll see here in a few minutes. And it was recommended that certain object codes be grouped into different categories, and we tried to do that to align with the committee request and align with the DPI chart of accounts, uniform chart of accounts, as close as possible. There may be, a few differences there, but we tried to do that as best we could in the preparation of the line-by-line review here. That just kind of gives you an outline of what we did to get to where we are now. So, pause now, if anybody has any questions before we get into looking at the actual numbers, the spreadsheet information.
Okay, any questions, discussion?
I believe now is a great time for a 10-minute
I
break.
think so. Second, motion by Mr. Hensley, second by Carter.
He took it before I did.
All right, let's do, any questions though before we wrap this part up? Okay, I think great explanation on all the
Absolutely,
codes.
absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely,
Let's,
Andrew.
back at quarter till.
Yeah, very easy to
With your permission, Madam Chair.
let's get started again.
Mr. Cox, you want to play show and tell with your very broad view chart?
Okay. So what we did, as I mentioned in the actual presentation, was the Superintendent's Budget Committee met. They came up with a format, suggested categories of what they thought would be good to see today. So what we've done is we've tried to put that in a format, use that format, and present it as best we can. Here, so what we've done is, what I'm showing now are the overall categories. Some of them were suggested, some of them are added to try to align as much as we can with the DPI chart of accounts. And then we have, and that's what you see here in the category. I'm just showing the summaries right now. So it won't be so expansive, but I know each board member has a list of it broken out right now. And then along the top here, you see each location, which is going to be, you know, your district-wide, which we talked about that 000 code earlier. That's your district-wide expense there. It's really attributable to all the schools, not just one specific school. And then you see again, the location, the schools there at the top. So this is just a summary level of all the expenditures. You'll look down, I'll scroll down, just so you can see the different ones.
Mr. Cox, I think you told me before and I've forgotten. Why is it we have Aberdeen Primary still on the list for 2021?
Because they were still open part of the year.
Oh.
Well, no,
Well,
we're
you
still
still-
paying expenses, sorry. Southern
Yeah.
Pines Elementary, or Southern Pines Primary was open.
Well, as an example, you still have utility expenses and security
yeah.
expenses.
Right, yes, yeah.
Yeah, so
There
there's
was
maintenance
something up under-
expenses. So to the chair's question, that's your maintenance expenses for that school for whatever period this covers. That's our
Right,
carrying
essentially
cost
what it is.
for having an empty school.
Yeah, I was getting Southern Pines Primary and Aberdeen confused, sorry. But it did call that, yeah.
Mr. Cox, just real quick, what time period does this cover?
So this covers fiscal year '21, which is July 1, 2020 to June 30th, 2021. This is what we finished the year with last year. Again,
Right.
like I mentioned previously, didn't want it to be speculative of what we may
Right.
not spend or whatever. We wanted to take what we had spent
Right,
to look
that's
at.
perfect. So this is this is the
Year.
last entire
Fiscal
fiscal
year.
year showing where our money was spent.
Yes, sir, that is
Excellent.
correct, that is correct. And so, see here, I won't get into it too much yet, but we show the overall total here. This is a grand total line item for each school, each location. Then we put the average daily membership that we had at each location, and then we broke it out, a per pupil expense based on that average daily membership. And this average daily membership is the final. I'll go ahead and caveat, DPI has multiple average daily memberships. So this is the final average daily membership, which is one that's calculated at the end of the school year, which incorporates all the months of reports that were sent. And so this is the final one that they produce in June or July after all the school year is done for fiscal year '21. And so that's the number for each site. And I'll also mention that what I did for Aberdeen Elementary and Aberdeen Primary, I grouped their expenditures together because it would typically be at one school. And same thing for Southern Pines Elementary and Southern Pines Primary as well, to come up with their amounts.
I just want to say, I really like this format. My question is, I believe every 4 months, or maybe it's every 6 months, we get a reconciliation of what we've spent versus what our budget was. Do you know what I'm talking about there?
So we bring to you a amended budget resolution, which is a budget every 3 months, or typically somewhere around, quarterly
Right,
budget
right.
resolution. And typically in the fall of the year, depending on when the state budget is passed, you may only get one, because it's typically brought early in the year, November, February, and May. And sometimes that November one is the same thing as original budget resolution, so you don't get two during that time.
What I'm saying is, for me, I personally would prefer that in this format, because this format is easier for me to understand than the previous amended budget resolutions that you brought before us. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, and if I could chime in and kind of reinforce and both answer Mr. Levy's questions, just based upon discussions that we had in the committee. So, assuming that this is the format that we use going forward, and one of the goals was to make it automated, and it's important to say automated so there's not thousands of man hours going into this report. But in an ideal world, and based upon my experience in the private industry, is that this would also be your budget format. And then, Mr. Levy, what you would do is periodically throughout the year, probably quarterly, you would do a budget execution. So just as we have here, you know, just to orient everyone, we have cost centers as columns, and cost centers are generally our schools. And then we have chart of accounts. We have accounts as the rows, right? So what I would suggest is that the budgets are done in this format, and then quarterly we have budget execution meetings where, and hopefully it'll be an automated report. For each school, you have three columns. You have the budgeted amount, you have the amount executed, you know, year to date, and then you have the difference. So then you can go through and see what schools are, you know, on budget, over budget, or under budget during their execution. But first, and I think the step today is, we're going through and familiarizing everyone with the chart of accounts and the cost centers to make sure everybody understands them and agrees with the concept.
All right, so, Mr. Hensley, you talked about the different, what he refers to as cost center, and I guess you could, that's up to your definition, because, you know, the chart of account has so many different components to it there. But what we've done is we've chosen to use, based on the budget, Superintendent's Budget Committee recommendation, object code right now. So we have broken it down to the object code level and grouped those object codes into certain classifications. So what I'll do, this is just, like I said, this is just an overview of the summary of each category. And we can look at anything you want to look at, but just kind of going over it. You see all the different schools, all the locations that we have here in this format. Sorry, hard to see there.
I'm sure if I could
So,
just give another conceptual talk about this. So just a few bullets on this and observations and the purpose of this. One is, as Mr. Levy said, that this should form, because it completely aligns with the object codes. It's important to note that this information is being retrieved from our existing data system, and it's our goal to make it automated so that Mr. Cox and his team just have to hit a button and produce this report. I was having hundreds of man hours into it. But what's the importance of this? Well, it can serve as the framework for your budgeting, as Mr. Levy said. It provides remarkable transparency to both the board and the public at large. They can go in and see exactly where our money is being sent, good, bad, or indifferent. You can do comparisons, and and being able to do comparisons between schools and among schools is great. One comparison is a tooth-to-tail ratio, what the military would call the tooth-to-tail ratio. You can see the ratio of what we spend on instructors versus administrators, and you can do that school by school, and the public can go in, and if they want to know, hey, what's the teacher to administrator ratio in High Falls Elementary, they can answer, that, or they want to, compare that to the what the district average is. You can also answer questions, and something that when Mr. Cox first brought this up, something that should have just jumped out at everyone is benefits are 27% of our budget. So right off the bat, you know, you can look at that and say, gosh, you know, Social Security is 4.2% of our budget. Healthcare is, gosh, I can't read my own handwriting, I jotted it down, but benefits are 27%. So being able to answer those questions, school by school and district-wide, is a remarkable tool for both us and the public. I would caution everyone, though, implementing this and understanding this is an iterative process. You know, you look at this, and in my experience, when you first start setting up good financials in this industry format, is you first look at it, and the first step is making sure everybody understands it. Everybody understands the cost centers or schools. That's straightforward. But you have to understand the chart of accounts, and you have to understand what goes into each line item, and more importantly, limitations. You know, we're never going to have 100% fidelity just because of limitations of our systems. That's okay. We just need to understand that. And then once you truly understand, oh, okay, I got it. We got these chart of accounts over here of the rows. We got the schools by column. Then we can start drilling down and analyzing the information and understanding, you know, why does Aberdeen Elementary have such a high electric bill last year? You know, there may be a good reason for it, or it might be, gosh, we have a malfunctioning thermostat, you know. But it allows us to identify that information, compare things to norms, and really understand where our money's going. And again, good, bad, or indifferent, and then it sparks all kinds of conversations among ourselves and among the public.
Right, and so depending on what the board would like to do, what I had planned to do is just kind of break out each one of them just to give you an idea of what we've included, what object codes we've included in each category. And then, you know, if you want to drill down further, you know, look at a certain school or whatever, we certainly can do that, depending on what the board prefers. So within our administration personnel total, we include the superintendent, any associate or deputy superintendent, directors or supervisors, principals, assistant principals, and myself, the finance officer. So that gives you what your total on administrative personnel is. So just for administration, again, these are things that were kind of suggested that Mr. Hensley alluded to. You know, it's an iterative process, which we could have open for discussion of moving things around or whatever if we don't feel like they're in the right category going forward. In administration, we include printing and binding, copier cost. Typically, our copier costs are in our supplies and materials, but in this case, because the state gave us non-instructional resources out of coronavirus money, they didn't have a supplies and material code, and so we had additional copies that we coded to that, so that's why this copier cost is in here by itself. Typically, those copy costs can be included in our supplies and materials line. So that's why it's only that $900 if you have a question about that. And I know we said we're not going to get into the details at this point, but just wanted to bring that up. Our postage for mailings, our membership dues and fees throughout the district, and then indirect costs are included there as well.
Mr. Cox, what's included in the bucket indirect costs?
So what indirect cost is what the federal government allows for us to charge federal programs, or, and also mentioned the SREC, the Regional Education Consortium, for, what word am I looking for administering their programs on their behalf. So it's to cover the cost of helping to offset the cost of electricity for whatever requirements that a federal program may have over the full life of that federal program for that year. So that's what indirect costs are. They're not, I guess they're not necessarily an expense expense to the district, they're more of an expense to a program. So like Title I, we would charge indirect costs of the Title I program, but what it does, it offsets the cost for utilities, heating and air, different things like that for administering the federally required programs. Yeah, okay, so the federal government approves and sets the indirect cost rate that we can charge as well. Thank you for bringing that up, Jenny.
It's an
So each
it's an
year-
overhead recovery rate.
What's that?
It's an overhead recovery tied to
overhead
these
recovery
federal
rate.
programs.
Right, yes, that's exactly what it is. And they set it and change it each year, and we have to go by that percent each year that they set and provide to us. And DPI sends it to us, but it's approved and dictated by the federal government, is what it is.
So just out of curiosity, and this is an example that'll show some of the complexity of this, indirect costs, and you used, electricity or heating costs as an example, but heating, electricity is that's a line item down below for each school. So do you actually reduce that for each amount, or is it?
We don't. It essentially goes into revenue and is used just to offset those costs, but we don't actually offset it at that line item.
Okay.
I know I've asked this once before, but I'm still a little confused on it. Depreciation, you've got $110,000 for depreciation, and it looks like on the ledger, it's a direct expense. Depreciation can't be, by its nature, a current expense. It could be a long-term expense, I suppose.
Yeah.
But
So
generally,
where are you seeing that?
well, you go down to depreciation.
What
which is a
category is that in?
It's depreciation. It's a line item.
Well, okay, so I
It's
understand
towards
that,
the
but,
bottom.
but we're looking at the categories right now, we're in the administration category.
Yeah, I think you got ahead of us.
Oh, am I ahead of you? Okay, I didn't know
That's
you
why I
were
was-
just looking. Okay, all right, that's
Hold on
fine.
to that one.
That's fair.
All right, so our benefits, what's included in our benefits? So we've got a lot of different line items there in benefits. We say that our longevity, this essentially comes from the state. If we pay a locally paid employee, we're giving them longevity, just like any state employee would get. Our supplemental pay to make us more competitive, to surrounding districts, we say that's a benefit. The employee allowances there, bonus pay, longevity pay, bonus leave payout that comes from the state, short-term disability, any salary differential as DPI classifies, annual leave payout, again, short-term disability, Social Security, retirement benefits, other retirement costs, hospitalization, workers' compensation, unemployment insurance, and life insurance. And each, again, as I mentioned before, each of you have the object codes from DPI that gives you a little more explanation of exactly what it is, if there's any question around what they are.
And part of the iterative process is getting accounts in the correct grouping.
Right, and that's what I had mentioned,
Right.
yeah.
And I would suggest that bonus pay, longevity pay, the competitive pay, I would suggest those are not benefits. I would suggest that overtime bonus, competitive pay and whatnot, I would suggest that those get moved up to the salary buckets. And benefits remain what benefits, the traditional definition of benefits, that's health care, which by the way is, health care, retirement. By the way, retirement's 12% of our entire budget. I don't think people realize that. 12% of our entire budget goes to pay into the employee retirement plan.
Right,
Anyway, my point is, I just want to point that out, but I think the benefits should be things like retirement, Social Security, health insurance, and move bonus and longevity pay up to the salary.
You know, and we can certainly have that conversation. The issue to me with that right now is because there's so many different classifications. So for example, if admin personnel, say myself, got a bonus pay, then there's no way for me to break it out under admin because there's only one object code.
Okay,
So it's all the bonuses
it's all
grouped
lumped
together, just like the longevity. So if we wanted to do something like that, we're gonna have to break it down further to some other way to do that. Again, I'm open to that conversation, but just the complexity.
What we
you
don't
mentioned.
want to do, and just so everybody understands this, is we don't want to create a whole bunch of work on our fiscal section. So if this is the degree of fidelity we have and it can't match, then, we'll live with that limitation.
And we may just create another category.
Or you create another category.
category and put those things in them.
Yeah, 'cause
But it's hard, those things that are all grouped together like that
Right.
by that one object code,
Right.
it's hard to put into admin, classroom teacher, because you can't do it because it's one object code. You'd have to add more components of the chart of accounts to do that, which then you get back out to the almost 12,000 lines for you to know really where every specific thing, the bonus pay, the teacher, a longevity a teacher got, or a supplement that teachers got as opposed to somebody else.
So I would suggest creating another category that stands alongside benefits. I don't know what to call it, but
Right,
basically
okay.
it's expenses that cannot be properly broken down, Probably unallocatable employee expenses would be a good title, good bureaucratic
Okay.
name.
And so that's kind of why we grouped them into benefits, because you can't break it out by those individual categories. We kind of looked at it and said, it's kind of a benefit, it's kind of a salary, but just because we couldn't break it out into those different pots, the classroom teachers, the admin, and so on, we just decided to put it in the benefits group, because it's sort of a benefit, but it's also, to your point, sort of a salary as well. All right, so all those are things that make up benefits. And to Mr. Hensley's point, by law, we're required to pay 21.68% of any person who's eligible for retirement salary into the retirement system on their behalf. So we had to pay 21.68% of their salary into the retirement system for every employee that's eligible for retirement.
Or put another way, if they were not participating in the, which they don't have an option, if we didn't have to pay into the state employment system, we could pay those employees 21% more.
If we did not have to pay into the state retirement system for retirement.
On their behalf,
On their behalf,
we could pay them 21% more, or whatever the percentage
or
is.
we'd have, well, that depends, because the state gives us money for retirement to pay into the retirement for our state paid employees. So
Right.
if we didn't do that, then they'd probably take that money away, so we wouldn't have that additional monies to pay staff.
Yeah, they don't, you're right. Yeah, I have nothing to add. I thought I was going to have something to add, but then you just said it.
But
I saw your
it's a
receipt.
real expense, you got to look, that's a big number.
Yes.
That's a huge number.
And this isn't, I don't want to get too far off the path, but, that's one of the things that we talked about in the budget committee last year. We showed that, yes, the state is giving us more money in education every year, but the retirement rate and hospitalization
Goes
rate
up.
continue to increase.
Goes up.
And so the state funds that, so we don't really have more discretionary
Yeah,
funding for our district. Yes, we get more money, but it's
Yeah.
allocated for a certain purpose,
Yeah.
which is retirement hospitalization, as an example.
And it is a good purpose.
It is a good purpose,
Yeah,
yes.
We're not contending that, but folks then get the impression when they're told that we have all this extra money, they think we have discretion over that money, and we don't necessarily. And just to amplify your point there, Andrew, if the state pulled away that obligation on our part, the history would show that they would also pull away the funding. and so
Correct,
the funding
yeah,
would go
yeah,
down.
correct.
If we could know that we could keep that money and come up with another way of getting it to employees and provide ways, other platforms by them to invest in their retirement, then that scenario would be applicable.
Yes, correct.
But it's not necessarily in line with the way history works.
Right. Mr. Denson, you had a
I
question?
just want to give you an
Comment.
example. The money, the funding we received from the state between 2010 and 2020, in 2020, we received like 12,700,000 and some $1,000 less. But the significant thing was, of the total increase we got between those 10 years, 96% of it was for salaries and wages, 96%. Unbelievable. But, you know, the legislature looked good, you know, they gave the teacher salary, but when you consider everything else outside of salary and wages, we had 4% increase. That's significant.
Yeah, and, you know, and that goes back to, you know, 85–90% of your budget is salaries and benefits. You have very little discretion over your budget. All right. So our next category there is capital, which is purchase of new sites, general contract, HVAC, miscellaneous contracts, improvement to existing sites, and then depreciation. And there, I guess that's Mr. Levy's question there.
Yeah. Depreciation is listed as about $110,000 expense. And it just seems to me that depreciation is, you generally add it in if you do anything, but it's not an actual expense that you
Really
pick
a
up money.
balance sheet issue.
Pardon?
That is correct. It's not a typical expense. I have to look into this just to make sure, but it's not, we're not doing it incorrectly, but to get a proper response to you, I'll need to look at that.
Well,
Yeah.
and again, Bob, that goes to the iterative nature. I've sat through many entities setting up financials, and it takes 2 or 3 attempts to get everything, and that's what you want to do, is identify these things in this iterative approach.
Well, right, I mean, this is obviously a cash system, that you're showing us, you know, cash expenses, as opposed to some accrual sort of thing. So, $110,000 showing up as an expense
Correct, it should be
with no
there.
place to go would be questionable.
So what Ms. Patno just mentioned was that at the end of the year, during our independent audit process, these are entries that come directly from our auditors that they tell us we need to make for depreciation. It's not where we charge an expense, and I have to verify with them exactly how that works, but they send us the entries that we book for depreciation.
My question is actually more of not so much an accounting question. I understand the difference between a cash and accrual type of accounting. But my question is, this should tell us where the money is going, okay? And money doesn't typically go somewhere when you depreciate. That's the key.
So, the depreciation is allocation of expense over the expected life cycle of the item being depreciated. So the purpose of depreciation is so let's say you build a $33 million school.
I'm familiar with the purpose
Bob,
of depreciation.
Bob, I'm making another point that's
Okay,
actually
cool.
to improve these. So, for example, you build a $33 million school, you don't expense that the first year because you're gonna use it for 50 years. So you divide it by 50 and then you expense that much per year. The issue with these financials, and this is my point, the issue with these financials is they're not complete financials. And we made a conscious decision not to put the income portion on there because the income portion just doesn't make sense. I mean, you know, we don't have cost of goods and cost of goods sold and all that. But one thing we have to guard against, I think this is the point that, I think this is the issue that Mr. Levy brings up, is we have to guard against, normally you would have your depreciation to offset your capital expenses, you know, what you spend on the capital. Well, we don't have that there because and this gets complex, so please bear with me as I think through it.
It's relevant for a balance sheet.
Well, right, it's relevant, it's relevant for a balance sheet,
But it's
but
not relevant as a cash
what
expense.
we don't have in
Right.
here are our assets, and
Right.
we don't have our asset
Right.
expenses. So therefore, I don't think depreciation belongs in here, because that's kind of a complete different set of books. If we want to do that, then we've got,
Right.
we're depreciating
We'll
it.
establish a balance sheet, and of course, we don't have taxes,
right, but
so we're not depreciating for that purpose.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
And the intent of this isn't, look, normally you'd have income statement, balance sheet, a P&L, have all that stuff, but the intention of this isn't to create those complete set of financials that a private company would do, I don't think. The intention of this is to show the expense side of the ledger. So I just don't think, to Mr. Levy's point, I don't think depreciation belongs in here.
Right, and that's, like you said, iterative process. You
Right,
know,
correct.
This is our first stab at it based on,
Right.
the committee's initial work. And we can go from there and modify it how we can to make it best of what's most representative, and what the board wants to see and is most, reflective of what it should show. And it is, Jenny did mention that, it's all related to child nutrition, these are all related to child nutrition, but something that we can look at going forward in that iterative process.
And also, I don't know, am I jumping the gun if I want to talk about 472 sales tax refund?
Yeah, that's not in this category.
Okay, all right, so I'll wait, I'll wait.
All right, so, this is self-explanatory, sorry, there we go. This is just your charters, your flow-through process that we have to give to the charters for, out of our local current expense fund, that we're required by law to give to them on a per-pupil basis. Our equipment, is 541, 542, equipment purchase, computer hardware purchases are two items that we have in equipment right now based on the DPI's chart of accounts. Our excuse me, under our food services category, we got our food purchases, other food process supply, other food purchases, and then transfers for child nutrition. Just to give an example what the transfer for child nutrition is, we're required by state law to transfer $45,000 onto state expense to make sure that the state meets their federal required match for us to continue to receive child nutrition dollars as a state as a whole. So this is something that every school district has to do, is a transfer of at least $45,000 onto state expense to ensure that the state meets their federally required match there. So in our health and medical personnel, we've got psychologists, therapists, and then contracted psychologists.
Mr. Cox, I have a question. This illustrates a good question, and really a limitation of the financials. So everyone will note that line 52, there's psychologists that are allocated to each school, right? Which is good. That implies.
They're not, though. How many psychologists do we
Well,
actually
no,
have on the staff?
as far as what.
Some expense, there's,
Well, Madam Chair, okay, let me restate so for the 5 schools that we can see up there, I can't speak for the other 17, but for the 5 schools that we see up there, it's allocated, which means that we either have a full-time person there, or somehow we've identified a partial person, and we've allocated it to,
all right.
unless we're hiring psychologists for $20,000 each, it looks like we've allocated some of them among the schools. You know,
Right, we don't have
yeah,
a full-time equivalent.
Right.
Yeah, right. Is that what?
Yeah, that's what I wondered, is
Oh,
how many
okay.
do we actually
So we have a
have?
portion at each school.
Again,
Right,
again,
okay.
the purpose of this, the purpose of me speaking is not to get into the debate whether we need a psychologist in each school or the wisdom of doing that. The purpose of me pointing this out is to, as I said when I started speaking right now, was to illustrate limitations and to make sure that people understand. Again, it wasn't to get into a conversation of the wisdom of how many psychologists we have. So, line 52, you have people allocated across. Line 53, we haven't allocated those to schools. And line 54, same thing there, is that has not been allocated to the schools, to each school. That's okay, but, and I assume that's a limitation, you know, either they haven't been allocated or it's a limitation of the system. As a board, we just need to look at these sort of things and decide, you know, line 53, do we need therapists broken down, allocated by schools? You know, maybe, maybe not, probably not, I don't know, but those are the sort of things as we go through these in an iterative process, we say, you know, line 53 is good enough, or we say, look, line 53, we need a little more fidelity. Is that reasonably and easily done? And if the answer is no, then, you know, we decide, or if the answer is yes, maybe we make another different decision. But this shows normally in companies, all those expenses would be allocated among the cost centers. But it comes down to, and this has been a recurring theme, it comes down to cost versus benefit. And what we don't want to do is put requirements on the accounting section where, you know, they can do this with a reasonable amount of effort, but then we put a demand on them and it takes 3 times the effort and something
Exactly.
that's not worth it. That's my point.
Yeah, so an example
illustration.
there, like therapists, and I don't know if this is the case, but this is just an example.
Right.
So however many therapists we have there, they may serve all 22 schools, but it may be 0.1 FTE or half, or it changes or fluctuate. You don't know really what it's going to be. So that's why we do it as district-wide, because they serve multiple ones across throughout the year. And it's not, okay, you're assigned to this school 10% or 25%. And typically, when we get over 2 or 3 sites, somebody serving 2 or 3 sites, we do it district-wide. So our limit is usually about 3, so 33%, or 25, 50, 25, whatever. That's usually where we cap when we try to break it out to multiple sites. So we're not having 10 individual line items for one teacher.
Right.
Or one employee. So that's, could be the limitation or what we have there as an explanation there for therapists. But understand what your point is related to that.
Andrew, just to be clear, as we leave that behind, just, that was 70,000 for that, the therapist line, that's 70,987. And would that be?
570, 987.
Okay, I thought there was a dollar.
No, that's a
Okay,
5.
It's my glasses, yeah, I was gonna say, I
Yeah.
thought it was more than that, thank
no,
you,
it's
okay,
5.
yeah, thank you.
Yeah. All right, so an instructional personnel excuse me, it's not instructional personnel, it's just instructional. Things that we didn't feel like fit in any other category but were instructional. Again, iterative process, we can change this however, were the costs associated with field trips, and then tuition fees there for, and that, I believe, were things associated with,
That was the federal programs where they reimburse them for taking classes and,
wasn't that part of the CTE program
Yeah,
as
CTE.
well, things like that? She's gonna look up a little more detail on that, just to make sure I'm not telling you incorrectly. Let's see. Yeah, so it's all related to career technical education. And so it's probably related to what word am I looking for? Certifications and things around that.
Credentialing coursework.
Thank you,
those
thank
types
you,
of things
credentialing.
Are programs that the CTE program subscribe to, pay tuition for, et cetera.
Thank you.
I want to know why the 18 cents for Social Security benefits.
Which line are we on there?
210, it's okay, never mind.
Well, and what that is, and I can tell you what that is. So,
It's not necessary.
and that's not gonna happen going forward. And I don't really want to get into too much detail, but the state used to have a process where they allowed teachers to have their pay spread out over 12 months if they so chose, which is called installment pay. This year, the state went away from that and took that away. So come June, we have to do what they call an installment accrual, where we've got to book the expense for next, well, it's not expense for next year, it's the pay that's going to happen in July that should be booked for the current fiscal year. After we pay out that July payment, DPI does what they call an installment collapse to do the actuals versus what was paid. We were, yeah, like a reconciliation process, and we were 18 cents off.
Which is good.
So that's what the 18 cents is.
I accept your explanation for the 18 cents.
So that's what it is, and that code is specific for that installment accrual process or installment collapse process. But going forward, we're not going to have that anymore because the state did away with their installment pay process through the state. So now teachers either have to work with their local bank, state employees credit union, or whoever to spread out their pay over 12 months. The state employees credit union has a specific program that allows them to do that called Summer Cash. Teacher gets with the credit union, says, hey, here's what my pay is. I want to have the same thing during the summer. Credit union says, okay, well then you need to set aside $2,000 each month, whatever it may be, or $500 each month. They tell us that they have signed up for that program, and then each payday, we send the credit union $500 for that teacher. And then during the summer, the credit union gives that teacher a paycheck in June and then a paycheck in July, just like was being done through the state installment process. But now we don't have to worry about the reconciliation anymore.
Awesome.
Okay.
So it's actually more advantageous to the teacher because they're in control of their money. When interest rates are good for earning interest on accounts, they earn interest on their money, where in the past, the state was earning interest on their money. And we were having to pay them, run extra processes to pay them, and now we're not having to do that. So it's a good thing. Good thing for the employees and good thing for us.
And an even better thing is that we know that we have a finance department that's worried about accounting for that 18 cents. Because I'm here to tell you, the minute an accountant says, oh, that's not important, just round that, it's time to start looking for another accountant. So anyway, congratulations. I'm glad to see the 18 cents there.
That's the good work of Ms. Patnode and now Ms. Love, which was Ms. Smith, Ms. Kim Smith.
You know, Ashley does a great job in payroll, so y'all appreciate y'all checks every month.
All right, let's see. So that was instructional personnel. So instructional personnel consists of your classroom teachers, your ROTC teachers, your foreign exchange teachers, those IFE teachers that we talked about, including your new teacher orientation, something that's required by the state for new teachers, your extended contracts where they may be doing some summer employment or something like that. Your master teacher is a teacher that works with your classroom teachers. Let's see, the other professional educator is really not another other professional educator. It's a code that's more of a held harmless code that DPI has put in there, that if we have to do checks back to certain years, that if the scale, if their pay on the scale is less now than what it was last year, the prior year, you can pay them what last year was, and then you code the difference to this 129 code. So it's really more of a held harmless code there for those educators. Your instructional assistant or teacher assistant, whichever term you use now, tutors, substitutes, again, more substitute, teacher assistant pay there. That's when they're subbing for a classroom teacher, curriculum development, planning period stipend, and then after-hours tutors make up what we have in the instructional personnel category.
So, as an example, again, highlighting the advantages of this, if you go to line 74, minus the roughly 22% paid in benefits, anyone in the district can go, us as a board, members of the faculty, staff, members of the public can go there and see that we spend collectively across the district, we pay approximately 33%. I used $130 million as a baseline. We spend 33% of our entire budget on instructional personnel.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Salaries. Yep.
Salaries, and again, there's plus 22%. But the important thing is, people can go and look at that, and they could go to their school and they could do what I did, and they could divide their total school budget by line 74, and they could see if their school is spending above or below the district norm. And, if it's substantially above or below, then they can ask the question. We as a board can ask the question, and parents can ask the question, and there may be a good explanation for it. But the point is, we now have this transparency. I use that as an example. I mean, there's hundreds of different examples, but that's the importance of publishing this and publishing it to this fidelity.
All right, our next category is maintenance. So you've got contract repair, maintenance equipment, you got rentals, leases, license fee, and then repairs, materials, and labor as part of our maintenance. And I'll also caveat, there's some things that are an overlap because your repairs, materials, and labor, again, limitation. Repairs, materials, and labor are also used in our transportation department. So this may not be totally representative of maintenance itself. Part of that expense is most likely in our transportation department. But when we just look at our object code, that 422, we grouped it as maintenance. I think that was one of the suggestions that we just left there when we were going through trying to figure out where to put the object codes. Limitation, similar to like bonus pay or longevity pay, that can't be broken out unless you add another layer to the report, which we can do if we want to do that, but a limitation at this level there. Let's see, maintenance, marketing. So marketing, again, just our advertising cost that we had there in the district. Miscellaneous. These were two areas that I think, you say unallocable, you couldn't really attribute it to a specific category. Because, for example, part of I believe our other professional technical contracts is what we pay for our financial software. So where do you put that? Then your contracted services could be EC, could be some other program, multiple things there. So that's why we just put it miscellaneous, because there's not one category that it really fits into. I mean, we could designate it as contracts if we wanted to designate it as a contracts line, but it has multiple things in there without adding multiple additional layers. you can't really capture exactly what that is. Another limitation that we face there. But again, part of the iterative process, if we want to change that, however we want to change that, we certainly can change that. But that's just where we have it right now for this initial review. Risk management. What we did, we tried to group all our insurances into the risk management category, put that into a risk management category, which is our vehicle liability, our property coverage, judgments, fidelity bond premium, student accident coverage, and then any other coverage that we have. The other coverage is our general liability coverage that we have there. So those are all our risk management portfolio or profile. It's all our insurance. What did I do there? Oh, I hit the wrong one, sorry. All right, our next category is our supply line, or supplies, which include your 411 supplies and materials, your 413 other textbooks, your library books, your computer software supplies, your non-capitalized equipment, non-capitalized computer equipment, and then your sales and use tax refund that Mr. Hensley wants to ask a question about.
I think it was me, but.
Oh, excuse me, Mr. Levy. I was
Yeah.
pointing to Mr. Levy, but it said Mr. Hensley, sorry.
That's
My apology on that.
That's cool. I see that that's an entry as a piece of income, and I understand why. But what actually gets me very, very upset, and I've talked about this before, is that apparently those sales tax refunds, which are generated because of the schools, don't go to our schools. As a matter of fact, a big chunk of that money was taken by the county commissioners and utilized to refund their general funds. We need to, through the chair or through the superintendent, to go to the county commissioners and to say that all of those refunds should go directly and automatically to the schools. And perhaps it should go to help reduce pupil-teacher ratio, so give them a purpose for it. But I don't like the fact that we only had 8,000 some odd dollars in refunds. We're about to embark on what, $21 million in ESSER funds, which is going to generate sales tax refunds of, I don't know, what's close to 7% of $21 million or something like that. Maybe that's not all call it $10 million.
Geez, that's $1.5 million.
So
Using your figures.
I think, wouldn't that be, that's sales tax refunds on capital and technology, am I correct?
Right.
So that's a smaller portion of the 21
So
million.
let's say, well, I was gonna say, $21 million, let's say the roof itself, or the materials themselves are half of that money. That's 7% of $10-11 million, which should go to the school system and should go for a particular purpose and should not go to the general fund of the county. So I think, because.
Let me qualify one thing that you said. The money they used to repay themselves was not this tax money, it was from the quarter-cent sales tax, correct?
Right.
That they used, and that would be a different.
Yeah, so I mean, I was gonna let Mr. Levy finish. This is different. What this is, so understand your point, and not saying that we don't need to work with the commissioners on sales tax for the monies that they spend on behalf of the schools, because that is money that they spend on behalf of the schools when they get the refunds back, and they choose, excuse me, they choose what to do with them. So that's a different situation, but one that if the board chooses to address, would address. What this is where we had those expenditures from our financial department, and we put them here in supplies and materials because generally that's where most of the sales tax refunds come, on supplies and materials. It's not, it's hard to, where you really group it, but again, we felt the supplies and materials generated the most sales tax refunds, so that's why we grouped it in supplies and materials. And we only get the county portion of the sales tax refund back when we file for that refund. And it's got to go, and it's supposed to go to the same pot that it was spent out of for use in the future. So it's not supposed to be used for just anything.
It's
So
designated.
if I spend it out of, what's a good code we spend it out of, a PRC?
300 for the, well,
Okay,
for the schools, we keep up, just to let you know this part, we keep up with, the reports from the school, and we give them back their portion of their sales tax, the 2.25.
so if we code it to PRC 300, the example I use, which is the district money that we give out to the schools for them to use for supplies and materials and some other things that they want to do, if they purchase those supplies and materials out of that 300 code, when we get the sales tax refund back in, we give it back to those schools in that 300 code for them to reuse again.
So when we spend this $21 million, well, let's call it $10 million in roofing materials and all that sort of stuff, okay? Does that go to the county, does the refund go to the county general fund or to us?
No, so it'll be our money for us to spend.
Yeah.
And if there's sales tax on it, we can apply for a sales tax refund. And it will need to go back to the program report code, whether it's ESER 1, ESER 2, ESER 3, where those monies were expended to be spent in future years, provided that we still have that PRC still available to us. So for example, when ESER money runs out, we complete a capital project that last year, just before it ends, we haven't been able to file for a sales tax refund yet. So when we file for a sales tax refund, then it's got to go back to the federal government, and we can't spend it because we don't have an allotment or an allocation in that program report code anymore.
Okay, so it's up to us to make sure that we keep that program open? So that
Well, we can't keep it open because the period of availability of funds is set by the federal government. So we can't keep it open.
So,
So we'll just lose that money, depending on,
so there's a
when we get that
sales
sales
tax,
tax
let me see if
refund
I
back.
get this right. There's a sales tax refund, but that refund has to go to the feds?
So if we
To
don't have,
reimburse the
so
feds?
if we no longer have that program report code open as allowed for us to spend, and DPI has not allotted us money in that code, then we do not have access to it, and yes, we have to return it.
Okay, wait, before we confuse Mr. Levy any further. There's a couple things here. That's one of the reasons why I'm always on John to stay ahead of schedule, all right? All right, if you have a situation where you have a project where there's going to be a delay of any purpose, you always have to stay ahead of schedule on your projects, get your money spent well in advance of deadlines so you don't get caught in this unlikely position. We always need to try, administratively, we try to avoid that circumstance.
file for sales tax once a year, refund.
I know that, but we.
also part of the problem.
Yeah, we got, that's the reason why we have to stay ahead. All right, now, I think one thing that would help Mr. Levy is because he is correct that there are expenditures for which the sales tax refund doesn't come back to us.
Not expenditures that we.
I understand that, but he's not picking
Right,
up
right.
on your
I'm not
nuance.
only
Okay,
limiting
got
it to
got
that. They're,
Yeah.
for instance, somebody else, I don't know, than that quarter cent sales tax situation. It doesn't come back to us, am I correct?
Quarter cent does not come back. The quarter cent that the county charges you for you going out purchasing whatever, where they've added that quarter cent sales tax, that does not come back to us. That goes to the county.
Which is essentially to, I'm talking about the refund on that. I'm not talking about the quarter cent. a quarter cent retires the bonds. I get that.
Right.
Okay, but there is a refund available, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, on the sales tax for that, for some of that.
So we get the county portion of the sales tax, that's, 2.5, 2.25%.
Can I-
The county charges that we get back.
Could I jump in and attempt to clarify this, please? So here's my takeaway from what I've heard, is if Moore County Schools applies for the refund for a sales tax, if we spend money and we apply for a sales tax refund, we're only eligible to get the county portion of the sales tax back.
Correct, yes, sir.
Okay, if we give money to the or if the county commissioners execute money on our behalf, and they apply for the sales tax refund, they get the entire sales tax refund in both the county and the state.
Right, correct.
So obviously, if we apply for the refund, we keep the refund, and then, we may or may not be able to apply it based upon whether the code's open or not.
Right.
But, so the question becomes, and I think this was Mr. Levy's original question, is if the county commissioners, they execute funds on our behalf, whether they originated there or we gave them to them, are they keeping that sales tax refund, or are they giving it to us?
Yep.
That's the question.
We don't see a sales tax refund line from the county. We see one overall amount that comes from the county.
Okay.
That would be a conversation with
Okay.
Mr. Vest
So, and
on
there-
how.
That
But
would be,
that's the conversation that I want us to have with
That's
Mr.
right.
Vest.
Understand. So we
Right.
properly define the question, that's another day.
Right, that's what I'm saying, yeah. So that's a separate situation from this line item of sales tax refund.
okay, quite obviously, the thing I want to make sure I get in here, and Mr. Hensley's right, we need to kind of move on, but the reason why the county holds the digital money is what?
So they can get the sales tax money.
Thank you. And so that money then, getting to Mr. Levy's question, when they get that sales tax money, we don't know if they're making that part of the revenue, they're putting that into current expense or not. Mr. Levy's then, if he wants to be an advocate on this, or he wants us to be an advocate on this, it's to make sure that money is held, that when the county gets that money, that money's held harmless and not put into the general fund and come back in local
Correct.
expense where it's.
Understand his point, yeah.
That's right.
So
And so
if they
that's
spend
where
700,
you were aligning it to what you had here, but he was asking another question.
well, that's what I was saying, so his question is a different question, it doesn't pertain to this, so I was trying to get us back to this to explain this.
Understood.
Okay, that's fine. I think I've made my point.
Yeah.
Point well made, sir.
And I appreciate the effort, but the key is that that all the sales tax refunds need to come back to us regardless.
So if
And
they
not-
spend
not to-
$750,000 and get, and I'm just using this example because I don't know what it is, but $100,000 in sales tax refund, then we should have access to $850,000 instead of
That's
$750,000, is your point.
precisely the case.
Well, so, let me interject one thing. So, if they give us $1 million for technology, and I use $1 million because the math is easy. So let's say 7% sales tax. They give us $1 million for technology and they're keeping the tax refund, then really they should say they're giving us $930,000 because that's what they're doing, right? But, and they can justify that in their mind however they want, and maybe they factor that in, who knows? Because to Mr. Cox's point, they just give us a blob and they don't say, but, and I think this is a very valid point, if we're gonna give them ESSER funds to execute on our behalf to save the sales tax, then part of that deal needs to be, we get the refund, or we get 90% of the refund, and
that
they,
is
and they can
exactly
keep,
correct.
and they can keep 10% of the
Exactly.
refund for their trouble and overhead. But I think, the point is, look, the money that they give us, okay, whatever, but if we're giving them money to execute for us, then we're getting the vast majority of that sales tax refund back.
Yeah,
Or we should just execute it
I'm
ourselves.
not aware of us giving them any money to execute on our behalf.
Oh,
The only
I thought
thing
that
the only thing I know of is, they keep the digital learning fund and capital, funds there, so they can get the sales tax refund on that. No, not the capital, because they give us the capital, the digital learning fund is the
The
fund.
digital learning fund.
But then, they do expend because of the bond, those
Construction.
expenditures, construction, yes,
The
thank you,
bond-
that's what I was.
The bond premium money, that's
Right,
correct.
that's what I was alluding
And
to.
so that's the big amount that Mr. Levy would be interested in.
Correct.
Is how
That's
much
right.
sales tax refund did the county get back? And the county manager's aware of that, and he's aware that we're interested in having that conversation. It's just a matter of us bringing
that
the
conversation.
package, right?
So there's two issues. There's the bond premium money and there's the sales tax refund money. And if the voters of Moore County voted for a $113 million bond, whatever it was, $100 million bond issue for the schools, what they didn't vote for is that the county commissioners scrape 7% off the top in sales tax refunds. So we need to be made whole on that. Anyway, another day.
You know, the other thing, and this goes along with Mr. Levy's, is the quarter-cent sales tax is what they use to pay themselves back for our digital, funding, the $750,000, right? They paid themselves back out of the quarter-cent sales tax money.
They say they're using the quarter-cent sales tax to cover debt service.
Right,
Well,
right.
yeah, to
Debt
debt
service.
service, but didn't they just make a payment to themselves to cover?
That was out of, sorry.
You're right, you're.
You're correct, but they used the, sales tax from the bond funds
Okay.
for that, actually the interest earned, on
The
the bond
quarter
funds.
cent sales tax is for the bond, but the tax refund on the quarter cent sales tax is, they scrape that off the top. Yeah.
From
Okay.
that, correct.
Right.
At any rate, we need money for teachers in fourth and fifth grades, and this'll help. That's the bottom line.
Agreed, although I'm guessing there are some restrictions about funding out of the bond funds for anything other than capital. And there'd be some limitations
I
to-
think, yeah,
for that.
yeah,
But
yeah,
that's a whole
yeah,
nother.
that-
whole
that-
nother
Then
thing. Yeah.
we'll use it for heating oil. That's
Yeah,
fine.
Mr.
For
Mis-
heaters.
Mr. Hensley's point about for another day
Yeah.
will work, because there is a conversation to be had there, and we'll be prepared to have that. What the county manager, and I think he doesn't mind me saying this, but he always separates out reoccurring expense from one-time expense. And I'll try, and the expectation when we bring presentations is we try to align our one-time expenditures with one-time revenues and reoccurring expense with reoccurring revenues. That's part of the narrative that exists. Now, we can change that narrative going forward, but that's where we've been for multiple years. And so with respect to an infusion of revenue from sales tax associated with the bond, it is fair to predict that the county manager would see that as sort of a one-time infusion where he might need a pretty strong case to tie that to a reoccurring expense. So if we came back, for example, where we felt like we were going to come up short with modernizing the 6 gyms, and we needed additional money to finish that last gym or 2, that may be a stronger negotiating point than trying to tie that money to any sort of reoccurring expense, including additional teachers. So that's not the final word on that, but when we come back to that on Mr. Hensley's other day, that would be a part, I think I would owe it to the county manager to make sure I explain that to everybody in advance.
All right, our next category is support personnel. Our support personnel includes instructional support 1 and instructional support 2. The difference is broken down in the information that I have provided to you from DPI. Lead teachers, interpreter, translator, school-based specialists, monitors.
Mr. Cox, what are monitors? What is the definition of monitors?
So a monitor is typically someone that's required by the EC area to ride on a bus with a student. That's the majority of those expenditures, if not all of those expenditures.
Okay, thank you.
Is it sometimes called a bus aid?
It
Is there a
may-
difference
it may be
if-
Is
called-
this an IEP one-on-one? Is that what you're talking about?
No, it's not for a one-on-one, it's specifically for transportation that's required, and it may be, and I can't say this because I'm not 100% certain, but it's probably listed in the IEP that they have to have that monitor on the bus. but I'm not 100% sure.
I just want to make sure, because there are EC bus aides, and I want us to be clear with the
So it could
board.
be considered
Is there a
bus
difference
aid.
between, is there a monitor in addition to the bus aid or not? And let me defer to Dr. Locklear.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that question, sir, so I can't answer that. What I can say is that our EC buses do have monitors on them. I don't know if that's synonymous to bus aid. That's most likely not in an IEP. It could be an individual child that they have to have a one-on-one with them on the bus. That would be something that might be in the IEP. But that is, I would say, primarily an EC service.
I don't know about the board, but I'd like an answer to that question, what we do with EC buses, because I was assuming monitors were bus aids, so.
And there's
can
not
we-
there's not
Give
another,
me, give me an answer on that,
there's
please.
not another category to pay as a bus aid. The only category is monitor.
Understand, but there's reality, and then there's the spreadsheet,
right.
and the superintendent would just like a clarification from staff on that, and then if the board's interested, I'll pass it on.
There are some instances on regular ed buses where we have bus monitors, but that is, you could probably count that on one hand versus what we provide for EC.
And in that case, recently, I had a clarification, that person is called a bus aid, the one that we have currently is called a bus aid. And so, so just as we look at this sheet, and we look at the explanation I got about the bus aid on that one bus, I'd like to be cleared up on that, as soon as staff can give me that explanation.
All of the expenditures out of that 147 object code is out of our EC pot. So it's all related to EC. Clearly.
I had a question on overtime pay. What would that consider? Is that like a football game or custodian pay? What's the overtime?
So the only overtime pay that we have are our dual employees that where they may drive a bus in the morning and then they're a custodian and drive a bus in the afternoon or
Okay.
somewhere like, those are the only ones that we actually pay overtime.
Okay.
All other employees, or get comp time, compensable time
Okay.
instead of actual overtime pay.
Okay. So, because some of them are really high and then some of them are really low, is that grouped because of more buses or?
And also for after-school daycare, if they're doing more with after-school daycare.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Charges upfront.
So she was mentioning, you know, if they're also doing employee after-school daycare. I was just
Okay.
giving the example of
That makes sense.
a TA or,
Mhm.
I mean, a bus driver and a custodian. Same thing could be a TA and a bus driver is
Okay.
another example. So if they're dual employed, they get overtime pay. Otherwise, if they're non-exempt from fair labor standards,
Mhm.
then they would get comp time, be taken at a future time instead of being paid overtime.
Okay, makes sense.
And we, yes, sir.
No, go ahead. Exempt and non-exempt, comp time, non-comp time, that is something that we should take a closer look at a future meeting. We just don't want to run afoul of labor laws. I'm sure it's well in hand, but there are lots of minefields there. Are
Right, yeah,
they a professional
correct.
employee, are they not, and, you
And I
know.
think that Dr. Alpenfeld does a great job to make sure we have them classified accordingly to make sure we're not running afoul. But yeah, certainly can have that conversation.
Happy to make a presentation. The executive director for human resources and our legal counsel are obsessive about our
Okay,
compliance
that's good to
with
hear,
that.
that's good to hear. Maybe we don't have to have the conversation.
Yeah,
but it
that
an
is
important
something we
topic.
pay very close attention to.
good.
So anytime the board wants that broken out, we can do that. But I think you'll be impressed, and Dr. Alpenfels, I know, is very, very attentive to that.
My antenna just went up, no preconceived judgment, just kind of, wow.
All right, and then you see the rest of the categories here: non-certified instructors, school resource officers, office support, technicians, admin specialists, non-teaching substitutes. Question was raised during the committee meeting, what is a non-teaching substitute? That's your bus subs, your cafeteria subs, as an example of those that are non-teaching. Your custodians, your cafeteria workers, your skilled trades, which are your maintenance employees, your manager, then, before and after school and daycare, you don't see anything there because we're just a pass-through, for them. The school, as I mentioned, that, Fund 7 childcare, they can't pay any personnel out of, their, local school account. They've got to submit the personnel payments to us. So it's just a flow-through, as an internal control to make sure they're complying with, employment, requirements, for the district.
I have a question on line 114, since we're talking skilled trades. If you could highlight that line, please, and then, just so we can keep track of it. And if you could scroll to the right, I'm interested to see which schools have dedicated skilled employees. The central
None.
office, so that's the maintenance shop
Maintenance,
back here,
yes.
okay, all right.
Which serve all the schools. So we don't say, okay, well, you know, you may be here 0.1% of the time and so on, going back to that other,
And then, John, please discriminate on the manager line. Why is there an amount per school on the manager line?
that's your child nutrition, your cafeteria manager, that serves that specific.
Okay, so that's
school.
not related to maintenance, that's related to child nutrition, but we didn't make that
The
clear
manager,
before.
Right. But that's what it is, yes, sir. Yeah.
So I would,
Sorry, John. Go ahead and chime in there.
I will, so let's talk about,
moving, but the sound was there.
let's talk about the central office, cost center. I would suggest if that $570,000 or whatever are maintenance people that work on the buses or whatever, I would suggest that they are actually that's a district-wide expense, unless they just do maintenance on the central office, which I don't believe is the case. So I think that's misapplied.
Yeah, we'd have to look at that and see, who's actually coded there, to make that determination.
Right, you know, and you look at the line above, you know, there's a custodian for the central office. Clearly, the central office has a custodian, right?
Correct,
So that's
correct.
Clearly, the central office doesn't get $570,000 worth of maintenance workers, you know, replacing our carpet or fixing our lights or whatnot.
That's the default, and so there would have to be some formula that would be applied to break it out, but it does serve the whole district.
Right,
Yeah.
and again, that's an iterative.
Yeah, so we'd
approach.
have to look to see what employees make up that $570,000, to see what it is, because it may be coded appropriately.
But,
But
and
yeah,
here's,
to your point, we need to look at that.
and here's why it's important, and, you know, I'm not pointing it out just to, you know, gotcha. It's important because, you know, for a citizen to look at this and go, oh my God, the central office cost us $2.6 million, well, the fact of the matter, you know, you can subtract at least $570,000 from that.
Especially if they're not listening to the meeting and they're just looking at this, so I see your
Sure,
point.
right, yeah, just look at the, you know, the financials should stand on their own.
All right, training, professional development, teacher mentor pay, stipend, there's nothing there. Staff development participants, staff development instructor, workshop, travel reimbursement, and employee education reimbursement are all part of the training category there. Then you got your transportation, excuse me, which is your medical exams, your contract pupil transportation, gas and diesel, oil, tires, tubes, vehicle purchases, license and title fees. And again, a caveat that, similar to the 422 code that was listed in maintenance, that part of the materials and labor really goes to transportation, but you can't break it out based on limitation. Same thing with gas, diesel fuel, oil, tires and tubes. We have district maintenance vehicles that use that. So it's not just transportation, part goes to maintenance as well, the maintenance department there.
That transportation almost be logical to call those vehicles or something, because it's not, like you said, transportation department.
If we wanted to do that, you're right, yeah, maybe change the title of the category.
But driver's ed wouldn't be into any of these as far as like the vehicles, would it, or it would?
Yeah, for the maintenance of the vehicles,
It
because
would.
of tires and oil and
Okay.
gas.
Yeah. You know, and that's showing an expense in the driver's ed,
True.
pot. So transportation personnel, which is your driver and your driver overtime, pretty self-explanatory there. And then the last category we have broken out at this point is our utilities, which is your electric, natural gas, water, sewer, waste management, telephone, mobile communication, and fuel for facilities. And then the last item we talked about is the grand total for all of them. Again, we can look all the way across if we want to. We added in the ADM, like I mentioned to begin with. We took that total for each location that had an ADM, which were the schools, and divided it by that ADM, that final ADM, to come up with a per pupil expense by location.
Well, let me ask, we have, I believe our IT department is located at Pinckney, is that
Correct.
the central part?
Correct, yes,
Do
sir.
you allocate them to Pinckney, or do you allocate them to the central office?
Central office,
Okay,
because they're not part of the school
no, no,
over there.
I
Yeah,
get
I'm
it.
just saying, but that's why, yeah, because they're not part of the school, so we code them to central office.
I get it.
Any other questions or feedback at this point on where we are in the process?
I just have a procedural question. Madam Chair, and board members, I would suggest that this is the meeting. We've just had the meeting.
Exactly.
And I think that maybe there's a conceptual discussion about, the purpose of these and, any big blue sweeping arrows. So I don't think now's the time to get into, let's go to line 2,464 and what, there's a remarkable amount of information in here. There's a remarkable amount of transparency. This is an amazing first step. I am absolutely shocked and proud at the job that the finance department did, because what they did is they took information geared towards government reporting to Raleigh, just, hey, we're spending all our money, because that's all Raleigh cares about. We're spending our money and we're doing it legally. And they took that information that was coded in a system that mortals don't understand, and they translated it into, a financial report that I think is going to be valuable to all of us in our oversight role and the public, because it'll dispel myths, and, there's all kinds of myths. And again, as I said, good, bad, or indifferent. So I would suggest that, to the extent that any of our fellow board members have questions or what's the road ahead or this or that, and then, we adjourn and then we come back another day and we can discuss particulars.
And those particulars can be built into your work sessions too. You don't have to have a separate meeting. I know it's, for Mr. Holmes, this is, when he has a call, he's got to respond to it, and it makes it really hard for him to have a lot of these kinds of sessions. So sometimes you just take a piece of it and we can put it on a work session agenda and just work that piece a bit. So I'm very grateful to the Budget Committee. I think we have a workable tool, and if anybody has asked for something today that Andrew has not felt comfortable saying, no, I can't do that, then I'm sure I'll hear about it in a debrief and I'll communicate that. But in general, do you have any feedback for the feedback that you've gotten today in terms of letting the board be honest with us about anything that looks like it's beyond reach in any way? Because now would be the time to.
No, I mean, just happy to take whatever iterations there are.
What about the quarterly report? You've got the original budget coming up, and you're substantially completed on your preparation for the November 1st meeting.
Correct.
Help the board just, give us a reality check if we need to have it now.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, no, I don't think it's something that's feasible to implement, especially for the original budget.
Okay.
Since materials are due on Monday.
Yeah.
So, I don't think I'll be able to do anything in a couple of days to get that
But can you
changed.
conceptualize it for the
Something
next
that-
quarter maybe, or?
We could look at it for the next quarter and see. because it will be different, because budget is different than, expenditures.
Right.
But we can look at that and try to see how we can make it work. Certainly open to that conversation, to have that conversation.
The
and
format
look
that
at
we
it.
bring to the board every quarter, is that aligned with any report that we send anyplace else, or is that just the traditional report that we've used here for?
We don't send it anywhere else. It's very similar to many other school districts,
Okay.
because that is at the level of report that is required that we have to submit based on the general statute.
Okay, and that's what the auditors are looking for.
Yes, and what the auditor's looking for. We're still gonna have to provide that format
Okay,
for the budget resolution.
okay,
Can we provide backup documentation further in a different format? Yes.
okay, and that's what we'll work on.
But we still have to provide the resolution in the format that we present and, for the auditors, and general statute
Thank you.
purposes.
Okay,
Yeah.
So, to Dr. Grimacey's question, it's my thoughts, and I think it's our intent, is to, as was pointed out in the very beginning of this meeting, we're starting the next budget process. And I think that we're defining, and what we've seen here today was a previous year's expenditure. And we can look at this and we can refine this format and say, yeah, okay, this is it, man, this is where we need to be. And then, I don't know, in my mind, I'm not saying we should take the current budget and put it in this format and try to kind of look at budget execution in a way that the budget wasn't designed. Rather, what I'm suggesting, I think this is the intent, is the superintendent and the finance section listens to what we say, and then a format similar to this forms the zero-based budget that we use to develop the next year's budget, and then we track the budget development and execution using a format more like this. But the rest of the board can speak up, but I don't have any intention of going, oh, hey, yeah, do this in the current budget cycle, because it's unreasonable. We're halfway through it, or we're a quarter of the way through it, and it's not the way the budget was developed. So I think it's too much to get there, is what I'm trying to say.
and we appreciate that.
Yeah.
That gives us a little bit of grace, yeah.
But one thing, as we develop our next budget, this needs to be the beginning. This document needs to be the beginning, not the end. Because the goal is not to say, okay, this is what we did, let's see how to modify it. The idea is to go zero-based budget.
Correct.
And put it into this format, that's the real tough work,
Well, and we have to remember too that what we're dealing with is the superintendent's budget that will come to us, and that Dr. Grimacey and Mr. Cox and others who are involved in that process will begin that, whether it's a zero balanced budget to go forward or just what. But then we are not into the nitpicky part of trying to create a
what Mr.
budget, because
Hensley
that's
said.
what comes to us, and then we'll have that opportunity, as you said, to look at this and see how it has filled out the chart, so to speak, that's been laid out. And I think all of us now will go forth with much greater understanding. I mean, we had never done this before, and although I had a rudimentary understanding of budgeting, and I knew a great deal about the strings that were placed on the finance that comes into us, I did not have quite the ability to look into it that I now have. And so I really do appreciate having gone through this and seeing it really broken down in front of us. The one takeaway I'm seeing here is the difference in costs of educating children at the different schools, and what it takes to operate a small school as opposed to where you still got to provide them with all the aspects, as opposed to doing it in a much larger school setting. It's very valuable to see it broken down, and I appreciate all the effort that went into transposing this from the good old state way of doing it to this format. So it makes it very, very handy for us. Are there other questions or comments or suggestions that we want to pass on at this point?
I would just like to say that all of us appreciate the work that Mr. Cox and his team have done to get us to this point. Because we had what, Mr. Hensley, Libby, we had what, two separate meetings that Mr. Cox provided us information as we came in, and the process has been seamless. And to get us up to date on the codes and the layouts, and then pulling your information from your financial system down into this format has just been a lot of work. We know that it's been a lot of extra hours. So we just appreciate what you have presented us today. And I think our board members, I think we have learned a lot, you know, from reviewing all of this information. So we just appreciate all of the extra efforts, because I know it was a lot of hours, extra hours.
Appreciate that, and couldn't have done it without the team and the work they do behind the scenes to make sure everything is in the financial system. It's easy for me to go pull it out if they've got it in there, and they do a very good job with that.
Garbage in, garbage out.
Right, exactly. Garbage in, garbage out, and the team does a great job.
Yeah, and I also think that this gives us just a sense of, again, just appreciating the reconciliation process that we have in place. I mean, there are checks and balances in every step along the way, not at the end necessarily with our external auditors that we get in. I mean, they do come in, look at our books and confirm, but along the way, every month with DPI and the state, as you guys are back and forth with information, I just think we have a solid reconciliation process with our finances that we have in place.
You know, and you mentioned the auditors coming to the end of the year. We have regular communication with the auditors. If we're not sure of something, we reach out to them. They're very good to work with. We reach out to them and say, hey, we're thinking about doing this. It needs to be done this way. Is that how you expect it to be done? And either they'll say yes, or they'll give us suggestions of some other way. So they're very good to work with. We appreciate the support they give us. And we want to make sure it's done right to begin with, instead of on the back end find that we've done something wrong. And they are very helpful with that.
And my last point is, we often hear that from different ones, like at the state level, you know, we send money to the county and it's up to them to use it like they want to. But obviously, we have specific line items that we have to put dollars from the state in. So it helps us to understand our different buckets and pools of money as we receive them and how they have to be expensed out.
Mr. Dennison?
Yeah, the benefit for me to this is, I've been doing this for 20 years, so I understand the codes and all that, but what we have not been able to do myself is particularly look at each school, because each school has different needs and need different resources. And this will really give me a good idea to point out, because we know, we've been through the school improvement plans, we know what all the schools are doing. Some schools need a lot more help than other schools. So, you know, to me, I'll look at this and say, okay, how can we balance this out? How do our Title I schools, the schools that are not doing well, need more resources to get there, and work at, you know, how we can divide this money up to make sure we give them more of what they need to get us where we want to be. But
You know, one last note too, I'm looking at Ed because of the legislative committee, but as Mr. Levy has really focused on the sales tax aspect of things today, I know that has been on our legislative list for quite some time, is to lobby the legislature to eliminate the sales tax on school, because, Ms. Barath, you can correct me, I believe the community college does not pay sales tax?
That I do not know.
I'm pretty certain about that. I'm pretty certain the community colleges do not have to, and the charter schools do not have to. But your traditional public schools do. So you can check that, Mr. Cox, but I'm pretty sure that's the way
That's
it
been
is.
every year. What we want to do is then give us the sales tax deduction. Instead of having to go through the county, then we can get it ourselves.
And that would eliminate the process.
That's right, it would eliminate the problem.
Give it to us up front.
All right, well, unless there are further questions or discussion, we had board comments on here,
Board to-
but
Motion to adjourn.
unless somebody has something else to say.
I do. I have just two quick questions, and I do have actually a couple closing comments. So just a couple cleanup items, Mr. Cox. This does, actually, this is probably a fair warning. I don't think this includes local school expenses like, let's say, parking fees and how that goes out. There's no local school income and expenses on this, reflected in this, correct?
That is correct. That is done through a completely different financial system.
Right.
We go out and audit each year, but we don't necessarily manage the local funds as done through the other accounting system. This is only the centrally expensed funds of the district.
Understand. So I think it's a fair warning that maybe next year we do financials similar to this, so we have visibility as to what's happening at the local school funds. Again, that's gonna be a board decision, but hopefully my second comment is, once we get this finalized and we start publishing this online, I know this was online for the purpose of this meeting, but once we get this ready for prime time, I'm hoping that we publish it in Excel format so that interested people can download it and they can do their own modeling. They can say, what if, and they don't have to rekey it. And then finally, I just have a couple closing statements. So anyway, I just jotted down a few things during this meeting. This is important. This is important to everyone, and I've stressed this throughout the meeting. But it's going to bring focus. This right here is going to bring focus on where our dollars are going and any discrepancies or disparities in that spending. And there may be good reasons for it, or it might point out a problem. But either way, this is important, and this is going to be a great tool. And I think that much like Moore County Schools is leading the way in curriculum transparency by putting our curriculum, online, forward facing to the public, because we don't have anything to hide. We want to share what we're doing. It seems to me that doing this, we're going to be leading the way in fiscal transparency in publishing industry standard financials, which allows everyone, the Board of Education, faculty and staff, and the public, to see where our money's being spent, and as I mentioned earlier, do comparisons.
All right, any further comments? All right, then we will consider.
Madam Chair, I move the meeting be adjourned.
I second.
All right, a motion by Mr. Dennison and a second by Ms. Thompson, all in favor?
Aye.
All right, the motion carries 6-0. Have a good afternoon.